Hello, and welcome, my friend. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm glad you've chosen this quiet moment to rest, to breathe, and to let your mind drift somewhere far beyond the worries of the day. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let the slow rhythm of your breath match the soft rhythm of the sea. Because tonight, we're going on a long, gentle journey into one of the most enduring mysteries in human imagination. A story whispered across more than 2,000 years. A story about a world that rose in brilliance and vanished in a single night. A story we call Atlantis. Before we begin, take a moment to let the sound around you fade. Imagine the night settling softly over a wide, endless ocean. The moonlight stretches across the waves like silver silk. The air is cool, the sea is calm, and the world is quiet enough for ancient memories to rise again. Tonight, we're not searching for treasure. We're not chasing conspiracies. We're simply letting the story unfold the way it has always lived, half history, half dream. A story that belongs as much to the imagination as it does to philosophy, archaeology, and human longing. So, what if a great civilization truly existed out there, beyond the reach of our maps? What if it flourished with unimaginable wealth, power, and wisdom, only to disappear almost instantly, swallowed by the sea? And what if the only reason we even know its name is because a philosopher from ancient Athens wrote a few thousand words about it more than 2,300 years ago? That philosopher was Plato, and the world has never stopped wondering since. But before we explore myths and ruins, before we dive into debates and discoveries, let's begin with a simple question, one that has echoed for centuries. Why did Atlantis become a legend at all? It might surprise you that everything we know, every theory, every map, every book, every documentary began with just two short dialogues Plato wrote in the 4th century BCE, Timaeus and Critias. There are no earlier Greek records, no Egyptian inscriptions, no Babylonian chronicles, no secret scrolls buried in the sand. Just two philosophical texts, two fragments of thought from a teacher trying to explain something much bigger than a lost civilization. And yet, those fragments ignited one of history's most enduring mysteries. Why? Maybe it's because Atlantis lives in the space between truth and longing. It's just believable enough to feel possible, yet mysterious enough to spark endless curiosity. It's a perfect story. A powerful island kingdom, a people blessed by the gods, a city of rings and shining metals, a society rich beyond imagination. And then, without warning, a single catastrophic night when everything is lost. Human beings have always feared the sea, and we have always been enchanted by it. We travel across it, but we never truly tame it. We build our homes near its shores, even though we know it can sweep them away. The ocean is our oldest mirror, reflecting both our hopes and our vulnerabilities, and Atlantis is every dream we project onto that mirror. It represents human greatness, human pride, human fragility, and perhaps a warning about what happens when a society forgets the values that once made it strong. But tonight, this isn't a warning. It's simply a story. A soft, gentle unraveling of how one idea grew into a legend that has survived wars, empires, religions, scientific revolutions, and the rise of the modern world. So as you listen, let the story flow at its own pace. You don't need to analyze anything. You don't need to remember every detail. Just let the words carry you as gently as the tide. Imagine philosophers under dim lamplight in ancient Athens, speaking softly as the night deepens. Imagine medieval monks copying fragments of Plato while the world around them changed. Imagine Renaissance explorers sailing into unknown waters, hoping the next horizon might reveal a long-lost world. And imagine the millions of dreamers, artists, writers, scholars, and everyday people who kept the legend alive simply because it felt beautiful. That's the journey we're beginning tonight. From Plato's quiet academy, to centuries of silence, to the explosive rediscovery during the Renaissance, to the sweeping wave of modern theories from archaeology to mysticism to science fiction, all we're doing is following the thread. A single thread that began with a question much like the one you heard at the start of this story. What if an entire world could vanish, and yet never be forgotten? Let yourself drift toward that question. Let your imagination open a little. And as the gentle tide of this story continues, let your body grow heavier, calmer, and softer. You're safe here, you're relaxed, and we're just beginning our quiet voyage into the tale of Atlantis, the lost world that refuses to disappear. In the quiet heart of the 4th century BCE, the city of Athens stood like a tired survivor, still proud in spirit, still brilliant in thought, but undeniably shaken by the long and bitter wars that had carved scars into its people and its identity. This was an era when philosophers became physicians of the soul, when thinkers sought not only to understand the world but to repair it, to soothe a society bruised by violence, defeat, and political chaos. Amid this atmosphere of uncertainty and reflection, a man named Plato, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle, and one of the most influential minds in human history, began crafting ideas that blended memory, myth, and moral inquiry into stories capable of teaching truths too complex for simple argument. Athens, once the shining jewel of the Greek world, had suffered deeply from the Peloponnesian War, and although the city still pulsed with culture and intellect, its sense of invincibility had faded, giving birth to a more introspective age, where people questioned what had gone wrong in their society and how such decline could happen again. Plato lived in this fragile moment, watching a generation rebuild its values from the remnants of the past, and he used narrative not as entertainment, but as a deliberate tool, a philosophical instrument meant to guide minds toward wisdom through the soft pathways of story. For Plato, narrative was never merely decorative. It was a gateway into conversations about justice, virtue, and the delicate architecture of a well-ordered society. He understood that human beings respond not only to logic but to imagery, metaphor, and the emotional power of myth, and so he created dialogues where philosophical insights quietly unfolded through tales that felt ancient, mysterious, and eerily resonant. And among these tales, woven gently into the fabric of 2 dialogues written late in his life, appeared the story of Atlantis, a name that would echo through civilizations long after the marble of Athens had crumbled. To understand how Plato introduced Atlantis, we must first step into the circle of his students and listeners, gathered in the soft light of an Athenian afternoon, where philosophical discourse often began not with certainty but with an open door, a question, or a recollection from someone who claimed to remember an older, deeper story. In the dialogue Timaeus, Plato sets the stage with a sense of deliberate calm, offering his audience a conversation about the structure of the universe, the nature of the soul, and the ideal form of society, before gently shifting into a tale said to come from the distant past. This tale, he explains, is preserved not by the Greeks, but by the Egyptians, a people whose temples were believed to contain records stretching back thousands of years, surviving floods, fires, and the rise and fall of empires. Plato frames the origin of the Atlantis story through the figure of Solon, one of the most revered lawmakers of Athens, a man celebrated for his wisdom and admired for his travels to foreign lands. According to the dialogue, Solon journeyed to Egypt around the 6th century BCE and visited the ancient city of Cayce, where priests supposedly kept archives far older than any Greek record. There, in the stillness of a temple filled with symbols, columns, and hieroglyphs carved long before Athens rose to power, these priests shared with Solon a story of a mighty civilization that had existed 9,000 years earlier, a civilization that rose to great heights before suffering a catastrophic downfall. By placing the tale in the mouth of Egyptian priests, Plato used a familiar narrative technique. He attributed his story to a source that his audience would have considered ancient, authoritative, and deeply mysterious, lending emotional weight and credibility to a story that otherwise had no independent historical foundation. In reality, no Egyptian record known today mentions Atlantis, and there is no archaeological evidence linking Solon to such a tale. Yet Plato uses this framing effectively, creating a subtle blend of mythical antiquity and philosophical purpose that has captivated readers for more than 2 millennia. In Critias, the companion dialogue to Timaeus, Plato continues the story with greater detail, but the narrative is interrupted and ultimately unfinished, leaving scholars and storytellers across centuries to wonder what might have come next, or whether the incompleteness was itself intentional. A philosophical gesture suggesting that some lessons are more powerful when left as fragments. Within these 2 dialogues, Plato crafts a vivid and remarkably structured description of Atlantis, painting it as an island kingdom located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, situated in the vast waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a world the Greeks viewed as mysterious and barely known. He describes this island as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a geographical claim so immense that later generations struggled to interpret it literally, symbolically, or as a kind of hyperbolic storytelling meant to magnify the grandeur of a society destined for destruction. Atlantis, according to Plato, was organized in concentric rings of land and sea, circular bands that alternated perfectly, forming a kind of architectural harmony between nature and civilization. This design, at once practical and profoundly symbolic, made the city both defensible and aesthetically striking, with bridges, canals, and causeways connecting each ring to the next, revealing a society with advanced engineering and refined artistic sensibilities. Plato's description emphasizes materials that shine with the brilliance of mythic imagination. Walls covered in polished brass, inner fortifications lined with tin, and the innermost structures shimmering with orichalcum, a mysterious metal said to glow with a reddish light, second in value only to gold. The central island of the city held a majestic temple dedicated to Poseidon, the god believed to have founded the Atlantean line through his son Atlas, the first king whose name would give the island its enduring identity. Here stood a massive statue of Poseidon, driving a chariot pulled by winged horses, carved entirely in precious metal, and towering above all who entered. This temple, magnificent in scale and splendor, served as both a religious center and a political symbol, reminding the Atlanteans of their divine origin and the responsibilities that came with such a lineage. Plato goes further, describing a social and political structure built around 10 kings, each ruling a different portion of the island, who met regularly to deliberate on matters of governance, law, and justice. These kings traced their ancestry to Poseidon himself, and their duties were inscribed on a sacred pillar of orichalcum in the central temple, a reminder that authority must be anchored in moral responsibility and adherence to higher principles. But perhaps the most striking part of Plato's account is not the architecture, nor the metals, nor even the divine lineage of its rulers. It is the sheer scale of Atlantis' power. He describes an empire capable of fielding armies that numbered far beyond anything known in his world. Fleets of 1,000 ships, contingents of tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry in staggering numbers, and vast resources supported by fertile plains that yielded 2 harvests each year through sophisticated irrigation and canal systems. He speaks of a massive canal that stretched more than 1,125 miles, connecting the central city to the sea and enabling the movement of goods, resources, and military forces at a scale unmatched by any civilization of his time. Through these descriptions, Plato invites his readers to imagine an almost utopian kingdom, rich, powerful, well-ordered, and blessed with extraordinary natural abundance. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity, the philosopher plants a quiet but persistent warning, a seed that grows in the shadow of all this splendor. For in the early generations, Plato tells us, the Atlanteans were virtuous, guided by the divine nature inherited from their godly ancestor, and they lived in harmony with one another, respecting the laws and maintaining their sense of moral balance. But as time passed, that divine element within them began to fade, diluted through generations of mortal intermarriage, and weakened by the temptations that accompany unlimited wealth and power. Their humility gave way to ambition, their justice to greed, and their harmony to a hunger for domination that pushed them to expand far beyond their island. Eventually, the Atlanteans launched a war against the surrounding Mediterranean world, seeking to subdue nations and impose their rule on lands much older and more culturally rooted than their own. And yet, according to Plato, they were finally halted by ancient Athens, a city that he portrays not as the war-torn Athens of his own lifetime, but as a heroic, idealized version of the city, representing wisdom, virtue, and the courage of a well-governed society. In this story, Athens stands as the moral opposite of Atlantis, disciplined rather than decadent, modest rather than greedy, orderly rather than corrupted by luxury. Plato's narrative brings the two civilizations into conflict, and in this clash, he reveals his central philosophical message, that no matter how powerful a society becomes, if it loses its moral foundations, if it forgets justice, moderation, and virtue, it will eventually fall. Thus, when the climactic moment arrives, Atlantis does not perish because of military defeat alone, nor because of natural disaster alone, but because its people have lost the inner harmony that once made them strong. Plato describes a catastrophic event, a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, during which Atlantis sinks beneath the sea, disappearing into the depths where only memory and myth remain. This destruction, dramatic and swift, is more than a narrative flourish. It is a symbolic representation of how moral decline can lead to sudden collapse, how societies built on unstable foundations can be swept away with little warning. To Plato's audience, the lesson would have been unmistakable. Greatness requires virtue, and without it, even the most advanced and dazzling civilization can crumble into oblivion. For modern readers, however, the story's vivid imagery of an island swallowed by the ocean ignites our imagination in ways that Plato may not have intended. It inspires questions about lost worlds, ancient technologies, submerged ruins, and forgotten peoples, even though the original purpose was deeply philosophical rather than historical. In this sense, the story of Atlantis functions like a mirror, reflecting the concerns, hopes, and fears of each generation that revisits it. To ancient Greeks, it was a meditation on political ethics and civic duty. To Renaissance explorers, it was a clue to distant lands newly revealed across the ocean. To modern seekers, it is a symbol of mystery, possibility, and the tantalizing idea that somewhere in the world's deep past, humanity achieved heights we scarcely understand. But returning to Plato's intent, his narrative remains a masterclass in philosophical storytelling. By placing moral lessons within the structure of a dramatic tale, he created a vehicle for exploring themes that were central to his work: the importance of virtue, the nature of just leadership, the dangers of excessive wealth, and the fragility of human societies. Atlantis, in its splendor and collapse, serves as a metaphor for the human condition, our capacity for greatness, and our vulnerability to corruption. And by attributing the story to foreign priests, ancient archives, and a chain of transmissions stretching back thousands of years, he gave the tale a sense of timelessness, grounding his philosophy in an imagined history that felt both distant and intimately relevant. Even the detail that the dialogues break off before the story concludes adds to the intrigue. leaving readers suspended between what is known and what is suggested, inviting contemplation rather than closure. Through this incomplete narrative, Plato creates a space where myth and philosophy merge, where questions linger in the air like the echo of waves long after the tide has pulled back. It is this blend of structure and mystery, of moral insight and imaginative detail, that has allowed the story of Atlantis to endure, not merely as a myth of a lost island, but as a symbolic landscape where we explore ideas about human nature, society, and the consequences of our choices. For in the end, the core of Plato's message is not about geography or ancient engineering. It is about the invisible currents that shape civilizations, the values that uphold them, the temptations that weaken them, and the delicate balance that determines whether they thrive or fall. And thus, in the quiet of his academy, surrounded by students seeking truth amidst a world that had repeatedly disappointed them, Plato offered the story of Atlantis not as a factual chronicle, but as a philosophical compass, pointing toward the dangers of injustice and the importance of living in harmony with virtue. To listen to this story with modern ears is to hear not only the distant murmurs of an ancient tale, but also the soft, persistent resonance of a warning that remains relevant across centuries. For whether Atlantis existed or not, its rise and fall invite us to reflect on our own world, our own societies, and the paths we choose as we navigate the vast, shifting ocean of human history. And so, as we continue our gentle journey into this narrative, moving from Plato's philosophical landscapes into the long, winding road of interpretations, misunderstandings, rediscoveries, and reinventions that followed, we carry with us the knowledge that Atlantis, at its heart, is more than a lost island. It is a story about the soul of civilization itself. And yet, even after spending so many lines describing the grandeur of Atlantis, Plato subtly signals to his listeners that the true power of the story lies not in its details, but in the emotional and philosophical undercurrents that run beneath it. Currents that speak not only to the citizens of ancient Athens, but to anyone who has ever watched a great society rise, falter, and search for itself again. To fully appreciate why Plato chose to anchor this narrative in a time before recorded Greek history, we must understand that the Greeks of his era believed the deep past held a kind of purity, a golden age, when heroes walked the earth and societies aligned more closely with divine order. By placing Atlantis in that faraway epoch, beyond the reach of verifiable history, Plato granted himself the freedom to illustrate moral truths without the constraints of literal accuracy, allowing his audience to focus on meaning rather than fact. He understood something timeless about human nature, that when a story is set far enough from the listener's world, the mind stops defending itself and begins listening with openness, curiosity, and reflection. In this way, Atlantis becomes not a historical claim but a philosophical mirror held up to the Athens of Plato's own lifetime, a city struggling with the memory of war, disillusioned with politics, and unsure of the values that would carry it into the future. Athenians had once believed they were exceptional, destined for perpetual greatness, protected by their wisdom and guided by the virtues of their democratic ideals. But the long arc of the Peloponnesian War had shattered those illusions, leaving the city humbled and vulnerable, its institutions strained, and its people searching for answers in a world that no longer resembled their heroic self-image. For Plato, the story of Atlantis offered a vehicle to explore this decline not through accusation or direct criticism, but through an allegorical tale that allowed Athenians to see the dangers of moral decay reflected in a distant civilization of impossible splendor. In this sense, Plato accomplishes something extraordinary. He uses the rise and fall of an imagined world to illuminate the fragility of his own. He leads his readers gently to contemplate whether their society, too, might be flirting with the same temptations that led Atlantis astray: wealth pursued without balance, ambition untempered by wisdom, and political power detached from virtue. By linking Atlantis' downfall to moral decline, Plato aligns his story with themes central to his philosophy, particularly the idea that the well-being of a society depends on the harmony between its leaders, its citizens, and its underlying values. Just as the human soul must be governed by reason to remain virtuous, a civilization must be governed by justice to avoid corruption. And in the tale of Atlantis, Plato illustrates what happens when that harmony is broken, when desires overwhelm duty, when pride outgrows humility, and when a society forgets the principles that once made it strong. This is why he gives the Atlanteans such extraordinary wealth and power. Their abundance is not merely decorative, but symbolic, representing the kind of unchecked prosperity that can blind a people to their own vulnerability. When Plato describes their fertile plains producing 2 harvests each year, or their vast system of canals irrigating the land with mathematical precision, he is inviting us to imagine a civilization whose success becomes its undoing, whose achievements cloud its moral sight. In the same way, the gleaming metals of Atlantis, the gold, the silver, and especially the mythical orichalcum, are more than artistic flourishes. They suggest a society enamored with its own brilliance, dazzled by material splendor, and slowly drifting away from the virtues that once defined it. Even the concentric rings of land and sea reflect this symbolism, a perfect order that becomes increasingly fragile as the heart of the society weakens, like ripples outward from a stone dropped into water. When viewed from this perspective, the architectural marvels of Atlantis become metaphors for human psychology, illustrating how outer perfection can conceal inner imbalance. The Atlantean kings, bound by sacred oaths engraved upon a pillar of glowing metal, symbolize the duty of rulers to uphold moral laws that lose their power when the hearts of the rulers no longer honor them. Plato's choice to anchor these oaths in metal rather than memory reinforces the theme that external rules are insufficient if internal virtue has decayed, reminding us that no inscription, however beautiful, can preserve justice when the spirit of justice is lost. Thus, when the Atlanteans turn to expansion and conquest, seeking to dominate the Mediterranean and impose their will upon other lands, it marks not only a political shift but a spiritual one, a departure from balance that sets the stage for their collapse. Here, Plato's portrayal of ancient Athens becomes particularly significant, for he describes a version of the city that predates his own era by thousands of years, a mythical Athens that embodies the virtues he believed had been lost in his time. This ancient Athens is depicted as disciplined, courageous, and just, governed by citizens who live in harmony with philosophical truth and guided by leaders who understand the importance of moderation and virtue. The contrast between the two societies, Atlantis with its splendor and decadence, and Athens with its simplicity and wisdom, forms the core moral tension of the story, presenting a philosophical duality that resonates far beyond the specifics of the narrative. By having Athens stand against the ambitions of Atlantis, Plato subtly elevates the values he holds dear, illustrating that ethical strength can triumph over material might, and that a just society, even when faced with overwhelming odds, can defend itself through the integrity of its principles. In many ways, this is the most radical aspect of Plato's story. He envisions a world where moral order, not military force, determines the fate of nations, and where the downfall of a mighty empire serves as a cautionary tale for those who believe that power alone can secure greatness. Plato's audience would have understood this message deeply, for they lived in the aftermath of a war that had shown them the limits of power and the consequences of moral failure. They had witnessed the rise and fall of leaders, the corruption of institutions, and the devastating impact of decisions driven by ambition rather than wisdom. In this context, Atlantis becomes more than an island. It becomes a symbol of every society that forgets the delicate balance between strength and virtue, a symbol of the human tendency to chase glory, even at the cost of stability. And perhaps most importantly, It becomes a mirror through which Plato invites his listeners to reflect on their own lives, their own choices, and their own responsibilities as citizens of a fragile society. Yet despite the philosophical depth of the story, the imagery of Atlantis is undeniably compelling on its own, and it is easy to understand why later generations became fascinated with the possibility that this civilization might have existed in some form. The description of vast ships sailing across open waters, the image of gleaming towers rising above circular harbors, the sense of a world advanced beyond anything known to antiquity. All of these visuals ignite a part of the imagination that craves mystery and discovery. There is a dreamlike quality in the idea of a city so symmetrical, so radiant, and so perfectly engineered that it appears almost otherworldly, like a lost garden of human ingenuity waiting to be rediscovered. Even the manner of Atlantis' destruction, a single day and night of misfortune, adds to its mystique, leaving behind a dramatic and haunting image of a world swallowed by the sea before anyone could fully grasp its downfall. The suddenness of this catastrophe taps into a deep, almost primal fear shared across cultures, that everything we build, everything we cherish, can be swept away in an instant by forces beyond our control. For Plato, this moment of destruction served a symbolic purpose, illustrating the cost of moral imbalance. Yet for later readers, it became a compelling mystery, an unanswered question hidden beneath the waves, tempting explorers, philosophers, and scientists alike. In this way, the unfinished nature of the dialogue, Critias, becomes part of the appeal, for the story of Atlantis breaks off abruptly, leaving centuries of readers suspended between revelation and silence, with only fragments to fill the vast gaps in the tale. Some have speculated that Plato died before finishing the dialogue, while others believe the incompletion was intentional, a philosophical gesture meant to encourage contemplation rather than provide closure. Regardless of the reason, the unfinished ending creates a space for imagination to flourish, inviting each generation to fill the silence with its own interpretations, theories, and dreams. This open-endedness has arguably done more to fuel the legend of Atlantis than the story itself, for what is incomplete tends to linger in the mind long after what is fully explained. It is in this fertile space between what is told and what is left unsaid that Atlantis transformed from a philosophical allegory into a global legend, slowly acquiring layers of meaning that Plato never anticipated. But before we drift too far ahead into the interpretations that would come centuries later, it is important to remember the atmosphere in which Plato first shared this story, an Athens both wounded and wise, searching for clarity in a world reshaped by conflict. For the citizens of this city, the story of Atlantis was not a puzzle to be solved, but a reflection to be considered, a contemplative journey into the depths of civic virtue and the delicate foundations of social harmony. And when we listen to the tale through that lens as a philosophical meditation delivered in the soft glow of an Athenian gathering, we begin to understand why the story has endured, not merely as myth, but as a vessel of meaning. It is a story that invites us to look inward, even as we look outward, to consider the fate of a lost world while reflecting on our own. It is a story that bridges the ancient and the modern, reminding us that the questions Plato posed about morality, power, identity, and the fate of civilizations are questions that continue to shape our world today. And perhaps most profoundly, it is a story that endures because it whispers a truth we all sense but rarely speak, that every society, no matter how great, walks a fragile line between balance and collapse, between harmony and disorder, between wisdom and ambition. Atlantis, in all its brilliance and its downfall, exists as a gentle reminder of that truth, a reminder wrapped not in fear, but in reflection, inviting us to pause, to breathe, and to consider the deeper currents that shape the human world. In the centuries that followed Plato's lifetime, The story of Atlantis drifted through the ancient world like a soft echo, a whisper carried from library to library, from philosopher to philosopher, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes dismissed, and often left in silence, hovering at the edge of thought without ever fully disappearing. To understand how this happened, we must step away from Athens and move gently through time, following the thread of intellectual history as it winds through the schools of philosophy, through the rise of Rome, through the dim corridors of the early Middle Ages, and finally into the long silence where the memory of Atlantis nearly faded from the Western mind. For although Plato planted the seed of the story, it was the reactions of those who came after him, reactions of skepticism, indifference, and sometimes quiet fascination that shaped the long and winding fate of the Atlantis legend. And so, to trace this journey, we begin with one of the most influential thinkers the world has ever known, Aristotle. Aristotle, Plato's most brilliant student and yet his most independent critic, approached the story of Atlantis with the clear, analytical mind that would later define the foundations of Western science. Where Plato embraced myth as a vehicle for philosophical insight, Aristotle preferred arguments grounded in observable reality, logic, and empirical reasoning. He believed that stories should be measured against evidence, and that claims made about the world should be supported by verifiable facts rather than allegorical intention. So when Aristotle encountered the tale of Atlantis, he dismissed it with a single sentence that has echoed through history. The one who invented it also caused it to disappear. With this sharp and elegant remark, Aristotle made it clear that he viewed Atlantis not as history but as poetic fiction, crafted by Plato for philosophical purposes rather than as an account of real events. For Aristotle, the vivid details of the island, its circular harbors, its armies, and its downfall were no more historical than the elaborate metaphors found in Homeric epics. They were tools, beautiful, meaningful, but not factual. This statement became the foundation for the first major intellectual tradition surrounding Atlantis, the tradition of skepticism. To Aristotle and to many who followed his method of thought, Atlantis was a moral parable wrapped in dramatic imagery, useful for reflection but not for historical analysis. This viewpoint spread quickly, not because people disliked the story, but because Aristotle's rational method became enormously influential throughout the ancient world. His students, and later his interpreters, repeated his claim, embedding the idea that Atlantis was a philosophical fiction into the mainstream scholarly consciousness. Yet even as doubt spread, the story was never fully forgotten. Beyond Aristotle, other Greek thinkers approached the tale with a variety of attitudes, some dismissive, some uncertain, and some simply uninterested. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote expansive, curious accounts of distant lands, strange customs, and ancient peoples, drawing from Egyptian, Persian, and countless other traditions. He devoted entire passages to Egypt, describing its priests, monuments, rituals, and vast archives of memory. Yet Herodotus never mentioned Atlantis, not once, despite his well-documented fascination with Egypt and his willingness to record even the most fantastical claims from local storytellers. This silence is striking, especially because Plato attributed the Atlantis tale to Egyptian priests. If such a story had been widely known in Egypt, it would be unusual, almost unthinkable for Herodotus to have overlooked it. His silence, therefore, became a second foundation of skepticism, suggesting that Plato's tale did not reflect a broader Egyptian tradition but instead was crafted uniquely for his philosophical dialogue. Thucydides, another towering figure of Greek historiography, approached history with an even more austere method than Herodotus. For Thucydides, historical writing was a disciplined art, one grounded in first-hand observation, clear reasoning, and the careful evaluation of sources. He dismissed legends, avoided mythology, and focused only on human actions and the political forces that shaped them. In his monumental account of the Peloponnesian War, he analyzed the rise and fall of Athens with a level of rigor that remains influential to this day. Like Herodotus, Thucydides never mentioned Atlantis, but in his case, the omission is even more meaningful, for he frequently discussed the early history of Greece, examining migrations, conflicts, and the slow development of political structures. If a war between ancient Athens and a vast Atlantic empire had existed in Greek tradition, Thucydides almost certainly would have commented on it. His silence, therefore, stands as another quiet but powerful indication that Plato's narrative had no roots in the historical memory of the Greek world. Strabo, the great geographer of the early Roman Empire, also encountered the story of Atlantis and addressed it with characteristic skepticism. Strabo was deeply familiar with the geography of the Mediterranean and the lands beyond. He studied explorers' accounts, measured distances, and evaluated claims based on his extensive knowledge of the world. To him, the idea of a massive island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, was simply not compatible with what was known about the Atlantic Ocean. Strabo argued that Plato's description contradicted geographical realities, and that explorers had crossed those waters without encountering shallow seas filled with mud, the very reason Plato gave for why no one could reach Atlantis after its destruction. Therefore, Strabo concluded that Atlantis was an invention, a symbolic narrative crafted to illustrate philosophical ideas rather than a lost kingdom hidden beneath the waves. His conclusion, with its blend of logic and geographical expertise, reinforced the skeptical tradition established by Aristotle. Yet despite these dismissals, Plato's story did not vanish. A few thinkers attempted to defend its historicity or interpret it more literally. In the early Hellenistic era, Crantor of Soli, a scholar from the academy founded by Plato, is said to have accepted the story as true. According to later writers, although no direct writings from Crantor survive to confirm this, he supposedly believed that the Egyptian priests referenced by Plato had indeed preserved records supporting the tale. This claim was based on hearsay and later commentary rather than original documentation, but it demonstrates that even in antiquity, some individuals found the story compelling enough to explore it from a historical perspective. Still, these voices were few, and they were overshadowed by the dominant current of skepticism that flowed through Greek and Roman intellectual life. As Rome rose to power and replaced Greece as the center of Mediterranean culture, the literary and philosophical traditions of the Greeks continued, but with new priorities and perspectives. Roman historians such as Livy and Tacitus inherited the methods of their Greek predecessors, valuing first-hand evidence, political analysis, and moral lessons grounded in real events. Like the earlier historians, they had access to Greek literature, including Plato's works, but neither made any mention of Atlantis. For the Romans, the story held little relevance to their political and cultural concerns, and Plato's dialogues were valued primarily for their philosophical insights, not for their historical claims. The Romans admired Greek thought, but they were pragmatic. They cared little for myths that lacked practical or moral utility, unless those myths were deeply rooted in cultural tradition. Atlantis, with its philosophical origin and lack of independent corroboration, simply did not fit into their worldview. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire built roads, conquered territories, spread its language, and created a new intellectual landscape in which Greek texts circulated widely but not always faithfully. Many manuscripts were copied by hand, sometimes carelessly, and often selectively. Some texts were lost entirely, others were preserved only in fragments. And among the works that suffered from this slow erosion of history were Plato's, Timaeus, and Critias, the very texts that mentioned Atlantis. Then came the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, a slow fragmentation that ushered in one of the most transformative and turbulent periods in European history. As political structures fell apart, libraries crumbled, trade routes vanished, and literacy faded in many regions, the preservation of ancient knowledge became increasingly vulnerable. The Middle Ages that followed were not a monolithic Dark Age, as they are sometimes unfairly described, but they were an era in which intellectual resources were scarce and priorities shifted dramatically. Knowledge became concentrated in monasteries, where monks spent long hours copying texts deemed worthy of preservation. Their choices, influenced by religious context and practical needs, shaped the future of Western thought. Within this environment, Plato's dialogues faced an uncertain fate. The Timaeus survived because it contained discussions about the creation of the world that early Christian scholars found compatible with theological inquiry. But Critias, which contained the detailed account of Atlantis, was not widely copied. In fact, it seems that in many regions, the manuscript simply disappeared, either lost to time or neglected because it lacked the theological or moral significance valued by medieval scribes. As a result, the story of Atlantis faded, slowly and quietly, from the consciousness of medieval Europe. For many centuries, it was almost entirely forgotten, not debated, not explored, not mythologized, simply absent. This absence is one of the most remarkable aspects of Atlantis history, for it shows that the legend we know today is not an unbroken thread stretching back to Plato's time, but rather a story that nearly dissolved into silence before being rediscovered much later. During the Middle Ages, Christian theology shaped most of Europe's understanding of history. The biblical narrative, creation, the flood, the rise of nations formed the core of historical thought, and any event or civilization not explicitly connected to Scripture was often considered irrelevant or speculative. Within this worldview, there was little room for a vast, pre-biblical civilization like Atlantis, especially one said to have existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, far earlier than the biblical timeline allowed for human history. Thus, even if scholars had encountered the tale, they might have dismissed it as incompatible with sacred chronology. Moreover, Greek literacy declined sharply in Western Europe during this period. Plato was read mostly in Latin translation, and those translations were incomplete. The Latin translation of the Timaeus by Chalcidius, for instance, covered only a portion of the dialogue and did not include the full story of Atlantis. The Critias was almost entirely absent from medieval libraries. As a result, the intellectual world of medieval Europe had almost no access to the tale. Only in Byzantine lands, where Greek learning persisted longer, did Plato's works survive in fuller form, but even there, the story of Atlantis did not attract significant attention. Byzantine scholars focused on theology, political history, and Greek classics, but they largely ignored the idea of a sunken island empire described in a philosophical dialogue. And so, for nearly 1,000 years after Plato's death, Atlantis lay dormant like a forgotten seed buried in the soil of ancient manuscripts, waiting for the right conditions to sprout again. It would not awaken until the Renaissance, when the revival of classical learning, the rediscovery of Greek manuscripts, and the explosive expansion of geographical knowledge converged to bring the story back into the light. But before that great rediscovery, the story of Atlantis passed through a profound stillness, a long interlude in which it existed only as a faint memory preserved in scattered texts, scarcely noticed by the scholars who encountered it. And perhaps this is part of what gives the story its enduring allure, that a tale so nearly lost could return with such force, capturing imaginations across continents and centuries, as if it had been waiting patiently for the world to be ready for it once more. As we pause here, at the threshold between antiquity and the Middle Ages, we stand in a quiet moment of intellectual history, a moment where a legendary island sinks not beneath the sea but beneath the forgetfulness of time itself. To follow the story further, we will cross into the Renaissance, where the tide of history turns again, lifting Atlantis from centuries of silence and carrying it into a new age of wonder, speculation, and global exploration. As Europe stepped slowly out of the Middle Ages and into the bright, restless dawn of the Renaissance, a profound transformation began, a transformation of curiosity, of identity, and of the way human beings related to knowledge itself. For nearly 1,000 years, much of Plato's work had been hidden in the shadows of lost manuscripts, partial translations, and limited access to the Greek language. But the 15th century brought with it a hunger for rediscovery, a desire to reclaim the intellectual treasures of the ancient world, and a belief that the wisdom of the past could illuminate the challenges of the present. It was in this charged atmosphere that the story of Atlantis, long dormant and nearly forgotten, was lifted gently back into the light. The revival began in Florence, a city where art, philosophy, and human imagination intertwined in extraordinary ways. Under the patronage of the Medici family, scholars gathered to study ancient texts, translate them, and open their secrets to a world eager for learning. Among these scholars was Marsilio Ficino, a brilliant translator and philosopher who devoted his life to breathing new life into the works of Plato. In 1484, Ficino completed the first full Latin translation of Plato's dialogues, a monumental achievement that made Plato accessible to European scholars for the first time in many centuries. For the Renaissance world, this translation was not merely a scholarly accomplishment, it was a cultural awakening, a reconnection with ancient thought at a moment when Europe was redefining its identity. And within the pages of this translation, quietly nestled among Plato's cosmological and political reflections, lay the story of Atlantis returning to the Western world, like a long-lost memory resurfacing from the depths. For many readers, encountering Atlantis in Ficino's translation must have felt like discovering a forgotten myth, a tantalizing fragment of ancient history that hinted at unknown worlds and vanished civilizations. Unlike medieval Europe, where biblical chronology dominated historical imagination, the Renaissance placed immense value on antiquity, on the idea that the past contained truths more noble, more refined, and more profound than the present. Thus, when scholars read about an island empire larger than lands they knew, endowed with immense wealth, advanced engineering, and a dramatic, world-shaking downfall, their minds opened to possibilities that would have been unthinkable only a century earlier. Atlantis, at that moment, became more than a story. It became a question, a spark, a doorway into speculation and exploration. But the true ignition point for Atlantis' rebirth came not from manuscripts alone, but from something far more transformative: the discovery of lands across the ocean. In 1492, only 8 years after Ficino completed his translation, Christopher Columbus sailed westward and reached the islands of the Caribbean, opening a new chapter in world history and altering Europe's understanding of geography forever. Suddenly, the Atlantic Ocean was not an empty, featureless expanse, but the threshold to vast territories filled with unfamiliar cultures, monumental architecture, complex societies, and wealth beyond anything Europe had imagined. This discovery created a profound psychological shift. If civilizations existed beyond the horizon that Europeans had never known about, then what else might have been forgotten? What other histories might be hidden beneath time or sea? The parallels between the newly encountered societies of the Americas and Plato's description of Atlantis did not escape the attention of Renaissance thinkers. Reports brought back by Spanish explorers spoke of Tenochtitlan, the great city of the Mexica, with its engineered lakes, bridges, canals, causeways, and dazzling architecture features that seemed uncannily similar to the concentric rings and elaborate waterworks described in Plato's Critias. The sheer scale of the Aztec and Inca civilizations, their wealth, their temples, Their booming cities, built with precision and mathematical understanding, challenged European assumptions about what was possible beyond the borders of the known world. To many, it felt almost as if they had stumbled upon the descendants of a forgotten empire, perhaps even the remnants of Atlantis itself. This moment in history, where classical memory and new discovery collided, created what scholars have called a cognitive shock, a meeting of old ideas and new realities that reshaped European thought. The old world was no longer the center of the universe. The new world was no longer a blank space on medieval maps. And Atlantis was no longer merely a philosophical metaphor. It began to seem like a hypothesis worth exploring. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, scholars, missionaries, and historians wrote extensively about the peoples of the Americas, attempting to understand their origins, their cultural achievements, and their relationship to the broader currents of world history. Amid this intellectual ferment, several influential writers began drawing direct connections between the civilizations of the New World and the Atlantis described by Plato. One of the earliest was Francisco López de Gomara, a Spanish chronicler who published a sweeping account of the Americas in the mid-16th century. Gomara argued that the complexity and grandeur of American societies could not have developed in isolation, and he speculated that they might be linked to ancient worlds described in classical texts. To him, Atlantis offered a potential explanation, a bridge between the familiar and the unknown, allowing Europeans to fit the newly discovered cultures into a framework that made sense within classical history. Another scholar, José de Acosta, approached the question with both curiosity and skepticism. Acosta was a Jesuit missionary who lived extensively in the Americas and wrote one of the most detailed early ethnographic works on indigenous cultures. He admired the sophistication he witnessed, particularly among the Mexica and Inca, and he wrestled with the question of how such societies had risen to power without any connection to the Old World. Although he entertained the idea of Atlantis, Acosta ultimately leaned toward natural migration theories, believing that people might have crossed land bridges or traveled gradually over generations. But even in his more cautious view, the shadow of Atlantis lingered, shaping the questions he asked and the frameworks he considered. Perhaps the most influential figure in this intellectual landscape was Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, whose monumental works on the natural history and social structure of the Americas blended observation, speculation, and classical reference. Oviedo was deeply impressed by the engineering prowess of the indigenous civilizations, particularly their mastery of agriculture, irrigation, and urban planning. He noted similarities between American architecture and the monumental styles of the ancient Mediterranean, drawing comparisons that later writers would expand into elaborate theories about Atlantis' survival or dispersion. Although Oviedo did not insist that the peoples of the Americas descended from Atlantis, his writings helped open the imaginative space in which such theories could flourish. The fascination did not stop with scholars. The broader European public, exposed to tales of great cities, golden temples, and empires carved into mountainsides, began associating these wonders with the fabled world Plato had described. Stories circulated of lost kingdoms hidden in the jungle, of golden cities like El Dorado, of ruins whose origins seemed mysterious and ancient. Within this atmosphere of wonder, Atlantis became a symbolic vessel into which Europeans poured their hopes, fears, fantasies, and attempts to make sense of the unfamiliar. But despite the enthusiasm, one thing remained constant: the absence of concrete evidence. No ruins matching Plato's circular capital were found. No inscriptions spoke of Poseidon, Atlas, or the 10 Kings. No artifacts suggested a direct link between the Old World and the civilizations across the sea. Every connection was speculative, imaginative, or circumstantial, driven more by the shock of discovery and the human desire for narrative coherence than by archaeological fact. Still, the lack of evidence did little to dampen interest. The Renaissance was an age of possibility, and Atlantis fit perfectly into the intellectual mood of the time. It offered a way to integrate new discoveries into old world views, to bridge the gap between classical antiquity and the unfamiliar realities revealed by exploration. It allowed Europeans to imagine a continuity between the worlds described in ancient texts and the worlds unfolding before their eyes. At the same time, the Renaissance devotion to classical learning created a reverence for Plato that differed from the more pragmatic approach of earlier centuries. Rather than treating him simply as a philosopher, many Renaissance thinkers viewed Plato as a sage, a custodian of ancient wisdom whose writings might contain hidden truths about the world. This reverence lent Atlantis an air of credibility it had never enjoyed before. If Plato, wise, revered, and deeply respected, had written of a lost civilization with such detail, perhaps it deserved more than the skepticism of Aristotle and his followers. Furthermore, the era was filled with rediscoveries. Manuscripts resurfaced, statues unearthed, ancient cities uncovered beneath layers of earth and time. Each new discovery made the ancient world feel closer, more present, and more real. This sense of proximity to antiquity made the idea of Atlantis not only appealing but plausible. If Pompeii had been buried and forgotten, why not Atlantis? If manuscripts could be rediscovered after centuries, why not memories of lost worlds? Yet as compelling as these thoughts were, scholars still wrestled with the inconsistencies between Plato's account and the emerging evidence from the New World. The cultures of the Americas, as remarkable as they were, did not match the timeline Plato described. Their architectural styles, religious systems, and social structures bore no direct resemblance to the world of Critias. And the Atlantic Ocean, now traversed by ships on a regular basis, did not reveal any trace of a sunken continent. Thus, while Atlantis captivated the imagination, it remained elusive, always possible, always tantalizing, but never proven. What the Renaissance ultimately achieved was not a confirmation of Atlantis, but a revival of its power as an idea. The story became part of a broader intellectual movement that reawakened Europe's curiosity about the world, about the past, and about the limits of human knowledge. Atlantis transformed into a symbol of forgotten wisdom, a reminder that the world was far older, far larger, and far more complex than medieval scholars had believed. This symbolic power would only grow stronger in the centuries to come, shaping literature, science, archaeology, and popular imagination in ways that Plato could never have predicted. And so, as the Renaissance drew to a close, Atlantis stood at the threshold of a new era, an era in which scholars, explorers, mystics, and dreamers would all attempt to unravel its mystery. It would survive not as a relic of ancient philosophy, but as a living question, a legend reborn at the intersection of discovery and imagination. The story was awake again, and in the centuries that followed, its voice would grow louder, its influence deeper, and its interpretations more varied than ever before. As Europe moved from the Renaissance into the 17th century, the mood of intellectual life began to change once again, shifting away from the passionate rediscovery of ancient texts towards something calmer, sharper, and far more demanding. This was the slow dawn of the scientific revolution, a period when scholars no longer accepted ideas simply because ancient authorities had spoken them, but instead sought to test the world with observation, reason, and new methods of inquiry. The medieval reverence for tradition gave way to a new belief that truth could be uncovered through careful study, comparison, and systematic questioning. Within this emerging landscape, the legend of Atlantis faced new challenges, for the world was no longer willing to accept mysteries without evidence. Yet strangely, rather than fading away, Atlantis found new champions, some imaginative, some misguided, some brilliant, and all deeply influenced by the spirit of the age. The most ambitious of these champions was a Swedish scholar whose imagination was as vast as his determination. Olaf Rudbeck. Olaf Rudbeck lived in the 17th century, at a time when Sweden was rising as a powerful nation and seeking its cultural identity within the wider tapestry of Europe. He was a polymath, an anatomist, linguist, historian, architect, and visionary, who believed that Sweden had played a far greater role in world history than anyone realized. Driven by intense national pride and a desire to place his homeland at the center of ancient civilization, Rudbeck dedicated decades of his life to a monumental project that would reshape the European imagination, at least for a time. His conclusion, startling and immensely bold, was that Sweden itself, its ancient northern landscape, its river systems, its lakes and coasts, was the original site of Atlantis. This claim did not emerge quickly or casually. Rudbeck devoted more than 30 years to collecting evidence, traveling through forests and marshlands, studying ruins, mapping coastlines, and tracing linguistic patterns. He built an enormous structure of argument, a vast intellectual cathedral constructed from thousands of observations, half-connections, linguistic fragments, myths, and geographic comparisons. In his view, the ancient world had misunderstood the geography of the far north, and Plato's description, once properly interpreted, fits surprisingly well with various Swedish landscapes. He saw in the rivers of Sweden echoes of the canals of Atlantis. He saw in the local place names remnants of ancient languages, which he believed were the ancestors of Greek and Latin. He found what he took to be inscriptions, archaeological features, and structural similarities that pointed, in his mind, to a lost civilization once thriving where northern pine forests now stood. Rudbeck compiled all of this into a massive 4-volume work titled Atlantica, a book so large, so detailed, and so sweeping in its ambition that even his critics were astonished by the sheer scale of his effort. Each volume contained maps, linguistic analyses, historical arguments, and comparisons between ancient sources and Scandinavian geography. Rudbeck believed that Swedish was the original language of humanity and that many Greek and Latin words could be traced back to ancient Nordic roots. This belief, however, stemmed from a major methodological flaw. Proto-linguistics was not yet a real science, and the tools needed to study language families objectively would not exist for another 2 centuries. As a result, Rudbeck often mistook coincidence for evidence, similarity for ancestry, and poetic intuition for scientific proof. To modern historians and linguists, his conclusions are clearly incorrect. But to the scholars of his time, who were only beginning to explore relationships between cultures and languages, Rudbeck's work was both impressive and unsettling. It combined rigorous effort with imaginative leaps. It blended nationalism with scholarship. It suggested that the most ancient civilization had been Nordic, a claim that, while appealing to some, challenged the Mediterranean-centered worldview that dominated Renaissance and early modern thought. For a time, Rudbeck's theory gained genuine attention. Scholars debated his findings, noble families supported his research, and Swedish pride fed the growing belief that the nation had once been the heart of a forgotten golden age. In an era when national identity was taking shape across Europe, Rudbeck's claims helped Sweden imagine itself as not merely a northern kingdom, but the cradle of world civilization. Yet, even as his work influenced Swedish culture, other scholars elsewhere in Europe viewed his conclusions as overly ambitious and insufficiently grounded. His linguistic methods were particularly criticized, for they relied heavily on superficial similarities between words in different languages, a practice modern linguistics has long abandoned. Still, Rudbeck's efforts left a lasting mark on the Atlantis tradition. He demonstrated the extraordinary power of imagination when fused with scholarship. He showed how deeply the myth of Atlantis could adapt to new landscapes, new national dreams, and new intellectual climates. And even though his conclusions were later rejected, the creativity of his work inspired later generations to look at Atlantis not only as a fixed place but as a concept capable of reappearing anywhere human longing sought it. But the tide of history was turning. As Europe entered the 18th century, the intellectual atmosphere grew increasingly skeptical, disciplined, and grounded in evidence. This was the Age of Enlightenment, an era when thinkers championed reason over superstition, clarity over myth, and critical inquiry over blind acceptance. Under this new light, the sweeping claims of Atlantis theorists began to face much harsher scrutiny. One of the era's sharpest minds, Voltaire, took aim at the legend of Atlantis with his trademark wit and incisive commentary. Voltaire had little patience for theories built on fragile foundations or fueled by national pride. For him, the search for Atlantis embodied the excesses of imagination unrestrained by reason. He pointed out inconsistencies in Plato's account, contradictions in its chronology, and the lack of any reliable corroborating evidence from other ancient sources. With elegant sarcasm, Voltaire reminded his readers that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and that no amount of fanciful speculation could substitute for solid historical grounding. His critiques were not personal attacks against those who believed in Atlantis, but rather part of a broader philosophical project to defend rational inquiry against the seductive appeal of grand but unsupported ideas. Voltaire's influence during the Enlightenment was immense. His work circulated across Europe, shaping public opinion and encouraging a more cautious approach to ancient texts. Through his voice, Atlantis became less a plausible lost civilization and more a symbol of how easily the human mind can drift into myth when not anchored by evidence. But the Enlightenment did not silence the legend, it merely shifted the conversation, forcing scholars to approach the question with more discipline and care. Alongside Voltaire, another towering figure shaped the intellectual landscape: Edward Gibbon, the renowned historian best known for his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon was a master of critical method. He believed that history must be built upon reliable sources, examined with skepticism, and interpreted with caution. His approach transformed historical writing by emphasizing the importance of cross-checking accounts, evaluating bias, and interpreting events within broader cultural and political contexts. This method, precise, restrained, and grounded, posed immense challenges to Atlantis enthusiasts. For Gibbon, a civilization of the scale described by Plato could not have existed without leaving traces in the written or material record. He argued that if an empire as vast, wealthy, and powerful as Atlantis had truly interacted with the ancient Mediterranean, then Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern sources would contain references to it, but they did not. Not even fragments, not even rumors. In Gibbon's view, this absence was decisive. It was not simply that Atlantis lacked proof, it was that the story contradicted everything known about the ancient world from reliable sources. Thus, Atlantis failed every criterion of Enlightenment historical method. Gibbon also emphasized a point that resonates strongly today: history should not be shaped by wishful thinking or national pride. He warned that scholars must not impose their hopes or ideological desires onto the past. This idea, though directed broadly at historical practice, applied sharply to theories like Rudolf's, which attempted to reframe entire civilizations to suit local narratives. Through Gibbon's influence, Atlantis became, in the eyes of many educated Europeans, a fascinating but ultimately fictional story, a philosophical parable rather than a historical event. Yet the Enlightenment, despite its skepticism, did not kill the legend. Instead, it transformed it. The story of Atlantis shifted from a question of historical truth to a question of cultural meaning. Thinkers began to ask not where was Atlantis, but rather, why are we so drawn to stories like Atlantis? This shift created space for new interpretations, symbolic, allegorical, psychological, allowing the story to survive even as its factual claims were rejected. Atlantis became a metaphor for lost knowledge, for human hubris, for the rise and fall of civilizations, for the dangers of complacency and the fragility of greatness. In this more abstract form, it continued to inspire philosophers, artists, and writers who sought to explore the deeper themes hidden within Plato's narrative. Still, some scholars resisted the Enlightenment's dismissal of traditional legends. They argued that myths often contain fragments of truth, that oral traditions can preserve memories of ancient catastrophes, and that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. These thinkers did not claim that Atlantis existed exactly as Plato described, but suggested that perhaps some distant echo of a real event, such as the destruction of the Minoan civilization on Crete, had been woven into the myth. In this way, Atlantis remained alive at the margins of scholarship, neither accepted nor entirely discarded, waiting for its next resurgence. As the 18th century advanced, new scientific disciplines emerged: geology, early archaeology, comparative linguistics, and oceanic exploration. Each discipline brought new insights that challenged older assumptions about the age of the Earth, the origins of languages, and the distribution of ancient peoples. Paradoxically, even as these sciences made the literal Atlantis less likely, they also opened new avenues for imaginative speculation. Volcanoes, earthquakes, and shifting coastlines showed that land could indeed vanish or change dramatically. Fossils revealed extinct species and deep time. Ancient ruins uncovered beneath layers of ash demonstrated how entire cities could disappear and be forgotten. And explorers sailing deeper into the Atlantic found strange seafloor formations, volcanic islands, and mysterious shallows that stirred the imagination. Thus, the Enlightenment did not resolve the mystery of Atlantis. It reframed it. It demanded rigor, reason, and evidence, while still leaving room for wonder. It closed the door on implausible theories but opened a window into new forms of inquiry, forms that would eventually lead to both modern archaeology and the more speculative theories that blossomed in the 19th and 20th centuries. But at the end of the Enlightenment, one truth had become clear. Atlantis could not survive as history unless new evidence emerged. It could only survive as idea, as metaphor, as cultural memory. And in that form, it continued its long journey forward, quietly waiting for the next wave of discovery, imagination, and reinterpretation. The legend, though wounded by reason, was far from dead. It was merely changing shape, preparing to reappear in an age that would reinterpret the past with fresh eyes and boundless curiosity. By the time the 19th century unfolded across Europe and America, the world had entered a period of upheaval so profound that the very foundations of human knowledge began to shift. Industrial machines hummed in growing cities. Steam engines traversed continents. Telegraphs stitched distant lands together. And new sciences, geology, archaeology, anthropology, reshaped the understanding of human origins. It was an age of both confidence and confusion. A moment when humanity believed itself on the verge of understanding everything, yet simultaneously became more aware than ever of how much it did not know. In this landscape of curiosity and uncertainty, myths once considered faint whispers suddenly felt alive again, waiting for new interpreters, new voices, new dreamers to seize them. And into this fertile intellectual ground stepped a man whose imagination, energy, and conviction would alter the destiny of the Atlantis legend forever. His name was Ignatius Donnelly, and the world of Atlantis would never be the same after him. Donnelly was born in 1831 inches, Pennsylvania, but his life unfolded across multiple roles: lawyer, politician, reformer, writer, and relentless public intellectual. He was a man of restless ambition, a figure shaped by the idealism of 19th century America, a place where it seemed that ordinary individuals could rise to extraordinary heights through determination and belief. But Donnelly possessed something more than ambition. He possessed a powerful desire to find coherence in a rapidly changing world, to discover the hidden patterns beneath history and myth, and to reveal truths that scholars had overlooked. He believed deeply that human civilization held secrets waiting to be uncovered, and he saw himself as someone destined to bring those secrets into the light. In 1882, after years of research, reading, correspondence, and personal obsession, Donnelly published the book that would redefine Atlantis for the modern world. Atlantis, the antediluvian world. It was nearly 500 pages long, a vast, sweeping, heavily argued attempt to prove that Atlantis had truly existed, that it was the birthplace of human civilization, and that almost every ancient culture bore the imprint of its influence. For Donnelly, this was not speculation. This was revelation. He believed he had discovered the missing origin of humanity's shared myths, technologies, symbols, and monumental structures, and he was determined to show the world the evidence he believed had been hidden in plain sight. Donnelly's argument rested on several major pillars, each vast enough to feel like its own world. The first of these pillars was the idea that the global flood myths found in cultures around the world were not independent stories, but rather memories of a single catastrophic event, the destruction of Atlantis. From the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh, to biblical narratives, to indigenous traditions in the Americas, to Pacific Island legends, Donnelly saw a pattern, a world-shaking flood that wiped out a great civilization. Where scholars saw the universality of human storytelling, Donnelly saw evidence of shared trauma, a common ancestral memory traced back to a single drowned homeland. To him, the flood myths of the world were historical echoes, and those echoes pointed directly to Atlantis. The second pillar of Donnelly's thesis involved the architectural marvels of the ancient world, especially the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica. To Donnelly, it was inconceivable that such similar structures could have arisen independently on opposite sides of the world. He pointed to the shape of the pyramids, the use of massive stone blocks, the astronomical alignments, the religious rituals associated with them, and the mathematical precision with which they were built. He argued that the only reasonable explanation for these similarities was that both civilizations had inherited their architectural knowledge from the same ancestral source, Atlantis. Donnelly acknowledged the differences between Egyptian pyramids and Mesoamerican step pyramids, but he insisted that the underlying principles and symbolic meanings revealed a shared origin. In his mind, Atlantis was the missing link connecting these monumental achievements. The third pillar of Donnelly's argument centered on the technological and cultural parallels he believed existed across ancient civilizations. He noted similarities in metalworking, agriculture, mythological symbols, language roots, and artistic motifs. He pointed to the shared use of hieroglyph-like writing systems, similar depictions of gods, and parallel cosmologies describing sky realms, underworlds, and divine ancestors. He argued that such parallels were too numerous, too specific, and too geographically widespread to be mere coincidence. To Donnelly, these patterns were fingerprints of a lost super-civilization, a mother culture that seeded human progress across the world before its tragic destruction. And that mother culture, he insisted, could only have been Atlantis. Donnelly also invoked geological and oceanographic evidence, albeit interpreted through the less developed science of his era. He believed that the mid-Atlantic ridge, the Azores, and various undersea formations were remnants of a once great island continent. He cited shifting coastlines, volcanic eruptions, and seafloor depressions as proof that the Atlantic Ocean had undergone dramatic changes over thousands of years. He argued that ancient maps hinted at lands now lost beneath the waves. He believed that the Atlantic basin still held the ruins of Atlantis, waiting only for better technology to reveal its secrets. Though modern science has overturned these interpretations, Donnelly's geological arguments felt compelling at the time. especially to readers untrained in emerging disciplines like plate tectonics or modern seafloor mapping. But what made Donnelly truly influential was not merely the breadth of his claims, but the confidence with which he presented them. He wrote with the tone of a man absolutely certain that he had rediscovered a forgotten chapter of human history. His arguments, though often flawed, were laid out with an earnestness and clarity that persuaded countless readers. He offered illustrations, charts, maps, timelines, and cross-cultural comparisons in almost overwhelming detail. To many 19th century readers, he sounded less like a dreamer and more like a scholar revealing hidden truths. And because his book was written in accessible, vivid prose full of narrative energy and passionate conviction, it became a bestseller. Donnelly's vision of Atlantis was not just an archaeological theory, it was an entire worldview. He believed Atlantis had been the cradle of human civilization, the source of agriculture, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, and even spiritual traditions. He argued that after Atlantis sank, its survivors scattered across the world, carrying fragments of their knowledge into new lands. These fragments, he claimed, became the foundations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and numerous other cultures. Thus, in Donnelly's reconstruction, human history was not a story of independent development but one of diffusion, a story where a single, ancient super-civilization lay at the root of everything humanity achieved. To the academic establishment of the 19th century, Donnelly's claims were provocative, adventurous, and, in many respects, deeply flawed. But to the general public, they were electrifying. His book reached far beyond scholarly circles, capturing the imagination of ordinary readers who were already fascinated by tales of ancient mysteries, archaeological discoveries, and the expanding boundaries of the known world. Newspapers reviewed the book with glowing fascination. Debates erupted in salons and lecture halls. Explorers, spiritualists, amateur archaeologists, and curious thinkers all found in Donnelly's work a compelling narrative that seemed to explain the puzzles of the ancient world. For many people, Donnelly offered something they had long felt but never articulated: a unified origin story for humanity. At a time when old religious certainties were being questioned by science, and when cultural differences across the world seemed puzzling and vast, Donnelly claimed that humanity had once been united culturally, technologically, spiritually. He argued that the evidence was scattered everywhere, waiting to be recognized. His book spoke to a longing for connection, coherence, and meaning, a longing that resonated deeply in the 19th century mind. Because his ideas were so emotionally appealing, they spread quickly. People embraced his theories not because they were rigorously proven, but because they felt intuitively satisfying. Donnelly's cosmic narrative offered both grandeur and simplicity, a world shaped by a mighty civilization, a dramatic catastrophe, and a diaspora of survivors building new societies in faraway lands. His version of Atlantis became a myth for the modern age, rich, romantic, panoramic, and full of possibility. In time, Donnelly became known as the father of modern Atlantis theory. For nearly every major Atlantis idea of the 20th century, scientific, spiritual, mystical, or fictional, traces its roots back to his work. Theosophists, occultists, futurists, early archaeologists, science fiction writers, and fringe theorists all drew inspiration from Donnelly. His influence seeped into popular culture, shaping novels, newspaper reports, speculative histories, and even early 20th century films. Atlantis was no longer simply a tale in Plato's dialogues. It had become a living concept embedded in Western imagination. And Donnelly, more than anyone else, had made it so. Yet, despite the profound impact of Donnelly's work, his arguments contain substantial weaknesses that modern scholars quickly recognized and that eventually undermined the credibility of his conclusions. The most significant flaw in Donnelly's theory was his reliance on surface-level comparisons rather than deep contextual analysis. He noted similarities between pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Mesoamerica, but he ignored the vast differences in their construction, function, symbolism, and chronology. Egyptian pyramids were tombs built during the Old Kingdom, thousands of years earlier than Mesoamerican step pyramids, which served ceremonial and astronomical purposes. To scholars, these differences were decisive. To Donnelly, they were irrelevant. He focused on shape rather than meaning, on resemblance rather than cultural depth. Donnelly also compared myths across different cultures without considering how myths develop independently in response to similar human experiences. His assumption that flood myths must come from a single historical event ignored the fact that many societies lived near rivers prone to flooding or near coasts vulnerable to storms. He treated global mythological patterns as proof of diffusion rather than as expressions of shared human psychology and environment. In doing so, he underestimated the creativity and diversity of human cultures. Another major issue was chronology. Donnelly frequently linked cultures separated by thousands of years, compressing timelines in ways that contradicted archaeological evidence available even in his own time. He often cited linguistic similarities that modern linguistics has shown to be coincidental. He relied on outdated geological theories and misinterpreted natural formations as remnants of lost continents. Yet these flaws, though significant, do not diminish the creative brilliance of his synthesis. They simply reveal the limitations of 19th century knowledge. Modern scholars see Donnelly not as a scientist but as a storyteller, a bridge between myth and early scientific curiosity. His interpretations were often wrong, but his influence was enormous. He took a nearly forgotten legend and transformed it into a global cultural phenomenon. He provided a narrative so sweeping that it captured the imaginations of millions and continues to echo in modern discussions of ancient civilizations, lost continents, and humanity's deepest origins. His work stands as a reminder that stories, when told with conviction, passion, and a sense of cosmic wonder, can become larger than facts. They can shape entire eras. They can define what people hope for, fear, and dream about. By the end of the 19th century, Donnelly had changed the world's relationship with Atlantis. He had resurrected it, not as a philosophical allegory, but as a lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered. He had shifted it from the realm of academic curiosity into the realm of cultural imagination. And through his influence, Atlantis moved one step closer to the modern myth we know today. A myth that blends science, mystery, adventure, and the eternal human desire to uncover the forgotten chapters of our past. As the 19th century drew to a close, Donnelly's ideas continued to ripple through intellectual and popular culture, setting the stage for an explosion of new theories, new interpretations, and new movements that would take the legend of Atlantis into unexpected directions. Spiritualists, mystics, early archaeologists, and speculative writers all found in Donnelly's work a foundation upon which to build their own visions. Some sought spiritual meaning, others scientific validation, and still others artistic inspiration. But all of them, knowingly or unknowingly, stood in the shadow of Donnelly's grand, ambitious reconstruction. He had given Atlantis a second life, and its next transformations, in the 20th century, would be even more dramatic. By the time the 20th century began to rise over the horizon of human history, the world had already endured the intellectual storms of the Enlightenment, the explosions of nationalism, and the bold fantasies of the 19th century. Science was advancing rapidly. Electricity illuminated cities, machines shrank distance, and new disciplines such as psychology, comparative religion, and anthropology were reshaping the ways people understood themselves. Yet even in this age of progress, something else was happening beneath the surface, something softer, stranger, and deeply human. Amid the noise of factories and laboratories, Millions of people were searching for meaning that science alone could not provide. They wanted stories that connected the past to the future, that explained the mysteries of consciousness, that offered a sense of spiritual continuity in a world increasingly defined by machines and material progress. And in this emotional and intellectual landscape, Atlantis re-emerged once more, not as history, not as philosophy, not as archaeology, but as a spiritual myth, a mystical symbol, and eventually a kind of modern religion. It was the Theosophical movement, founded in the late 19th century, that first transformed Atlantis from Donnelly's sprawling theoretical civilization into a metaphysical cornerstone for an entirely new spiritual worldview. At the heart of this movement stood a woman whose imagination and charisma were so extraordinary that she shaped the beliefs of countless people across continents, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky was not a historian, nor a scientist, nor a scholar in any traditional sense. She was a mystic, a visionary, a storyteller, and a self-declared messenger of ancient wisdom she claimed had been delivered to her through supernatural means. For her followers, she was a bridge between worlds, between East and West, between modernity and antiquity, between the physical and the invisible, and Atlantis, in her teachings, became not merely a lost civilization but a key stage in the evolution of the human soul. Blavatsky introduced the idea of the root races, a sequence of spiritual human epochs that unfolded across tens of thousands of years. In this cosmic framework, humanity did not emerge gradually through biological evolution, but through metaphysical transformations. Each root race represented a phase of consciousness, a shift in human potential, and a new step in the development of the soul. According to Blavatsky, Atlantis was the home of the fourth root race, a race of beings who were both physical and spiritual, endowed with capabilities far beyond anything known in the modern world. These Atlanteans, she taught, possessed profound psychic powers, the ability to manipulate subtle energies, and advanced technological knowledge built upon the use of crystalline power. They communicated telepathically, harnessed energy fields, and lived within a civilization that blended science and mysticism so seamlessly that the two were indistinguishable. Their downfall, she said, came not through accidents of nature but through moral corruption and the misuse of their extraordinary abilities. Unlike Donnelly, who tried to ground Atlantis in comparative history and archaeology, Blavatsky claimed that her information came from esoteric revelation knowledge transmitted by masters, spiritual entities or ancient adepts who, she said, guided human evolution from behind the scenes. This approach did not require evidence, dates, or artifacts. It only required belief, imagination, and the willingness to accept that the visible world was but a thin veil over deeper truths. In this sense, Atlantis became a spiritual allegory for the rise and fall of consciousness itself. The Atlanteans, in her telling, were not simply people from the ancient world. They were ancestral spirits, whose mistakes still echoed in humanity's karmic memory. Blavatsky's writings swept across Europe, India, and America with astonishing speed. For many readers disillusioned by materialism, her vision offered a cosmic narrative far grander than anything in traditional religion or science. The idea that humanity had lived through vast cycles, that ancient civilizations had risen and fallen with metaphysical purpose, and that spiritual evolution unfolded across worlds and ages, it all felt profound, comforting, and full of mystery. Atlantis, in this worldview, became a spiritual homeland, a symbol of forgotten wisdom, a reminder of past greatness and past hubris. Its destruction was not merely a geological event, but a moral and karmic turning point in human destiny. As theosophy grew, so did the mythology surrounding Atlantis. Lectures, books, and spiritual societies repeated and expanded Blavatsky's ideas. Artists painted luminous visions of Atlantean temples, Mystics described memories of past lives in Atlantis during trances and spiritual sessions. Occult writers introduced crystalline technologies, floating cities, and psychic laboratories. Atlantis became a canvas for the imagination, a symbol of a lost perfect world, a place where the boundaries between science, magic, and spirituality dissolved. But the myth did not end with Blavatsky. Another mystic, one of the most influential spiritual figures of the early 20th century, would take the legend even further. His name was Rudolf Steiner, and his approach to Atlantis was yet another transformation in the long evolution of the myth. Steiner, originally associated with the Theosophical Society, eventually developed his own spiritual philosophy called anthroposophy, which blended mysticism, esoteric Christianity, and a unique form of metaphysical science. For Steiner, the human soul passed through epochs of consciousness that shaped how people perceived the world. He believed that ancient humanity lived in a state fundamentally different from modern awareness, a dreamlike, intuitive consciousness deeply intertwined with nature and the cosmos. In this framework, Atlantis was not merely a geographical location or a stage of human evolution. It was an entire mode of perception, a collective state of mind that humanity had once inhabited. Steiner described Atlanteans as people whose consciousness was fluid, imaginative, and connected to natural forces. They did not think with the sharp, analytic clarity of modern humans. Instead, they understood the world in a symbolic, sensory way, perceiving images, intuitions, and living energies rather than abstract concepts. He believed that Atlantean society was powered by what he called life forces, subtle currents of etheric energy bound to the rhythms of the earth. Their technologies, he said, were organic rather than mechanical, responsive to thought, intention, and the vitality of nature itself. To Steiner, Atlantis represented a time when humanity lived closer to the spiritual world, before the hardening of intellect and material thinking that characterized later ages. According to his teachings, the destruction of Atlantis marked a turning point in the evolution of consciousness. As the Atlanteans misused their energies and drifted into moral imbalance, natural forces responded with catastrophic consequences. The earth itself shifted, climates changed, and vast floods reshaped continents. Humanity dispersed across the world, carrying fragments of Atlantean wisdom into new lands, where consciousness slowly evolved into its present form. Steiner's vision of Atlantis was not a historical claim, but a psychospiritual narrative, a way of understanding how human awareness had transformed over millennia. In his telling, Atlantis became a mirror through which modern humanity could understand its own limitations, its loss of intuitive perception, and its growing separation from the natural world. Steiner's influence spread through education, agriculture, medicine, and spiritual communities. Anthroposophical schools, such as Waldorf, and biodynamic farming practices drew indirectly from his Atlantean cosmology, embedding fragments of the myth into everyday practices. And while his claims about Atlantis were metaphysical rather than scientific, they contributed enormously to the 20th century's growing fascination with prehistoric civilizations, lost wisdom, and alternative histories. But even Steiner's profound contributions were not the final transformation of Atlantis in the modern era. A third figure, arguably the most influential promoter of Atlantis in 20th century popular culture, brought the legend to millions who had never heard of Blavatsky or Steiner. His name was Edgar Cayce, and he would become known as the Sleeping Prophet. Edgar Cayce was an American psychic who conducted thousands of trance readings throughout his life, addressing everything from health diagnoses to past lives to world events. Among these readings were more than 700 references to Atlantis, making him one of the most prolific sources of Atlantean lore in modern history. Like Blavatsky, Cayce presented Atlantis as a spiritually advanced civilization endowed with extraordinary powers, particularly in the realm of energy, healing, and crystal technology. He described vast temples where Atlanteans harnessed cosmic forces, devices powered by resonant energy fields, and a society that blended intuition, science, and mysticism. He spoke of flying machines, energy beams, and devices capable of transmitting power over great distances. For Cayce's followers, these descriptions were not symbolic, they were literal fragments of a forgotten technological age. But Cayce went further than either Blavatsky or Steiner by offering specific predictions about the return of Atlantean knowledge and the physical rediscovery of Atlantis itself. One of his most famous predictions stated that remnants of Atlantis would rise near the Bahamas, specifically near Bimini, in the year 1968 or 1969. And then, in an extraordinary twist, divers in 1968 discovered a mysterious underwater formation near Bimini, a long stretch of large, flat stones arranged like a roadway. This structure, now known as the Bimini Road, generated immediate and intense speculation. To scientists, it was a natural geological formation, but to Cayce's followers, it was exactly what he had predicted: a fragment of Atlantis emerging from the sea. The alignment of his prophecy with the discovery, however coincidental, gave Cayce immense credibility in the minds of millions and helped ignite the New Age movement's fascination with Atlantis. Cayce's readings claimed that many people living in the 20th century were reincarnated, Atlantean souls returning to complete spiritual lessons left unfinished when Atlantis fell. These individuals, he said, felt drawn to healing, energy work, metaphysics, and the search for ancient wisdom. He described a karmic cycle in which the mistakes of Atlantis, misuse of power, spiritual imbalance, destructive ambition were reappearing in the modern world. Humanity, in his view, was at a crossroads, similar to the one Atlantis had faced. Whether the world would repeat the same mistakes or transcend them depended on the spiritual awakening of individuals. Cayce's message resonated deeply in the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, decades marked by counterculture movements, spiritual exploration, and disillusionment with traditional institutions. Atlantis became a symbol for everything the New Age movement desired: a world of harmony, intuition, ecological balance, and spiritual knowledge. Workshops, books, meditation groups, and spiritual retreats centered on Atlantean themes flourished across America and Europe. The legend shifted from lost geography into living identity, a myth people could inhabit, remember, and spiritually reclaim. Because of Cayce, Atlantis entered mainstream consciousness. It appeared in documentaries, magazine articles, television specials, and countless books. It influenced early theories about ancient astronauts, energy healing practices, and alternative archaeology. It inspired artists, musicians, and filmmakers who sought to capture the dreamlike beauty of a civilization lost beneath the sea. By the late 20th century, Atlantis had become something extraordinary, a symbol that transcended history, fact, and scholarship, a myth embraced not because it was proven, but because it was meaningful. At this stage in its evolution, Atlantis functioned like a kind of spiritual homeland for modern seekers. It provided a sense of continuity with the ancient past. It offered an explanation for innate longings, unexplained fascinations, and the feeling that humanity had once been more connected, more intuitive, more whole. It symbolized both aspiration and warning, a memory of greatness and a reminder of what happens when power outgrows wisdom. And above all, it represented the human desire for origin stories that speak not only to the mind, but to the heart. Blavatsky had given Atlantis metaphysical structure. Steiner had given it psychological depth. Cayce had given it personal intimacy. Together, their ideas transformed Atlantis from an obscure Platonic allegory into a living mythology, one that shaped modern spirituality, alternative history, and popular imagination on a scale Plato could never have foreseen. By the end of the 20th century, Atlantis was no longer just a place. It had become a state of mind, a symbol of lost wisdom, a cautionary tale, a spiritual archetype, and a cultural phenomenon that touched nearly every corner of the modern world. It was invoked in discussions of consciousness, ecological collapse, extraterrestrial theories, reincarnation, and human potential. It inspired movements that sought healing, balance, and the rediscovery of ancient harmony. And its power, far from diminishing, continued to grow, feeding a mythology that still captivates millions today. As the 20th century advanced, the myth of Atlantis had grown so expansive, so colorful, and so deeply woven into popular imagination that it seemed unstoppable, a legend reborn through mysticism, romantic speculation, and bold interpretations that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Plato's text. But while dreamers and spiritual seekers kept Atlantis alive in the realm of myth, something else was happening quietly in the laboratories, universities, and archaeological sites of the modern world. A new kind of inquiry was emerging, one grounded not in intuition or revelation, but in measurement, excavation, and the slow, careful accumulation of evidence. This shift represented a profound change in how humanity sought truth. Science, with its instruments and methods, began to examine the past not as a canvas for symbolic stories, but as a complex landscape of artifacts, sediments, ruins, and geological processes that could be studied, dated, and understood. And as this scientific perspective deepened, it cast a cool, clarifying light on the legend of Atlantis, revealing what was possible, what was plausible, and what simply could not be. To understand this modern confrontation between myth and evidence, we must begin with archaeology, the science that attempts to reconstruct ancient worlds from what they left behind. And among all the archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, few were as thrilling or as relevant to the Atlantis debate as those uncovered on the islands of the Aegean Sea, especially Crete, Santorini, and the mainland centers of Mycenae. The first major breakthrough came with the excavation of Minoan Crete, a civilization that flourished between roughly 3000 and 1100 BCE. Archaeologists discovered vast palace complexes, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, filled with frescoes, storerooms, staircases, pipes, and elaborate administrative systems far more advanced than anything scholars had previously associated with the early Greek world. The Minoans possessed a level of organization, artistry, and maritime power that surprised even seasoned researchers. Their ships traveled across the Mediterranean, their architecture used advanced engineering. Their art was filled with fluid, natural images that seemed to speak of a people deeply at ease with the sea. Some researchers immediately noticed parallels with Plato's description of Atlantis, an island civilization, wealthy, powerful, connected to the sea, and possessing complex social structures. But the similarities ended just as quickly as they began. The Minoan world, though sophisticated, did not match Plato's scale, timeline, or geography. The Minoans existed thousands of years after the date Plato assigned to Atlantis. Their political structure did not resemble a 10-kingdom empire, and their island did not disappear beneath the ocean overnight. Even so, the discovery of the Minoans opened the door to a deeper and more nuanced discussion of what ancient civilizations were capable of, and how memory, myth, and ruins might intertwine across the centuries. The second major discovery, and perhaps the most dramatic, came from the volcanic island of Santorini, ancient Thera. In the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, archaeologists uncovered the buried city of Akrotiri, a Bronze Age settlement preserved under layers of ash from one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The eruption, dated to around 1600 BCE, produced a blast so powerful that it tore apart the island, sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean, and likely triggered massive tsunamis. The excavations revealed multi-story buildings, complex drainage systems, vibrant frescoes, and evidence of a society that was both artistic and technologically advanced. To many observers, Akrotiri looked like a world frozen in time, a city destroyed by a sudden catastrophe, its houses still intact, its streets still clear, its pottery still arranged as if the inhabitants had only just left. Some researchers began to wonder, could the destruction of Thera have inspired later legends of lost islands and sunken civilizations? It was a tempting idea. The eruption was massive enough to have destabilized the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. It caused seismic waves, tsunamis, and ash fallout that disrupted agriculture and trade. In the centuries that followed, stories of a vanished island, a drowned world, or an overwhelming catastrophe might well have circulated among seafaring peoples. And yet, despite these suggestive parallels, the timeline did not match Plato's. The Thera eruption occurred far too late to align with his claim of a civilization destroyed 9,000 years before Solon. The scale of Akrotiri, though impressive, was not remotely comparable to the vast empire described in Critias, and its destruction, though sudden and devastating, did not result in the complete disappearance of the island beneath the sea. The final major archaeological component of the early 20th century involved the Mycenaean civilization on the Greek mainland, the world of Agamemnon, the world that inspired Homer's epics. Excavations revealed fortified citadels, royal tombs, gold masks, and elaborate palatial complexes that pointed to a society both warlike and highly organized. Their architectural patterns, massive stone blocks, grand gateways, long corridors, seemed to define a kind of early Greek achievement that Plato might have admired. Some scholars speculated that Plato's description of ancient Athens, which he contrasted with Atlantis, might have been inspired by echoes of the Mycenaean world. But once again, archaeology drew a firm boundary between imagination and evidence. The Mycenaeans did not possess the kind of ocean-spanning empire Plato described. Their power was regional, not global. They left extensive written records and material evidence of their world, none of which hinted at a war with a mighty island across the Atlantic. These distinctions mattered. They revealed something crucial. Even when archaeology uncovered real ancient civilizations with remarkable achievements, none of them resembled Atlantis as Plato portrayed it. Yet archaeology did something else, something far more important. It showed that ancient societies were far more complex, far more capable, and far more diverse than 19th century scholars had imagined. This new understanding reshaped the entire Atlantis debate. If early civilizations could accomplish such feats without any connection to a lost super-civilization, then Donnelly's diffusionist theories lost much of their force. Independent development, not Atlantean heritage, became the more scientifically grounded explanation for the world's ancient wonders. But archaeology was only one part of the story. To confront Atlantis fully, science also had to examine the Earth itself, the oceans, the continents, the tectonic plates, and the geological processes that shaped the planet across millions of years. And this is where the legend faced its hardest challenge. With the rise of marine geology, oceanography, and seafloor mapping in the mid-20th century, scientists began charting the floors of the world's oceans with sonar technology. For the first time in human history, the deep sea, once a realm of total mystery, became a landscape that could be mapped, measured, and analyzed. The results were astonishing. Mountains, trenches, ridges, fault lines, and volcanic formations emerged from the darkness. The Atlantic Ocean, in particular, revealed the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a massive underwater mountain chain stretching thousands of miles along the center of the ocean. This ridge was the key to a breakthrough in understanding the movement of continents. As plate tectonics matured into a unified scientific theory, it demonstrated that continents move slowly across the Earth's surface, driven by currents of molten rock beneath the crust. This meant that continents do not suddenly rise or sink on the scale Plato described. Landmasses shift gradually over millions of years, not catastrophically in a single night. Most importantly, geological evidence showed that there had been no large sunken continent in the Atlantic Ocean within the last 12,000 years. The timeline often associated with Atlantis enthusiasts, the sea floor simply had no scars, no plate boundaries, no sediment disruptions, no collapsed shelves that could indicate the disappearance of a massive landmass. It was a continuous geological structure, consistent with millions of years of slow formation. When sonar mapping scanned the areas near the Azores, the Canary Islands, and other locations often proposed as Atlantean sites, it found volcanic islands, ridges, and plateaus, but no signs of artificial structures, ancient harbors, or sunken cities. The Atlantic floor was exactly what geology predicted it would be: stable, ancient, and devoid of collapsed continental fragments. This evidence was definitive. It did not merely cast doubt on Atlantis as a literary creation. It made the literal interpretation of a sunken continent geologically impossible. The same clarity came when scientists examined the famous Bimini Road, the underwater formation that Edgar Cayce's followers believed to be proof of Atlantis rising from the sea. Geologists conducted detailed studies of the stones, their composition, their fractures, and the natural forces shaping them. They concluded that the Bimini Road was a natural beach rock formation, created through normal geological processes, cracking, erosion, and natural cementation over time. Its appearance as a road was an illusion created by human pattern-seeking. Nature, not ancient civilization, had arranged the stones. The evidence was clear. The ocean floor did not hide Atlantis. The continents did not sink. No traces of large-scale ancient architecture lay beneath the waves. And yet, this scientific clarity did not diminish the emotional power of the Atlantis myth. It simply reframed what Atlantis could be. Another major area of scientific inquiry involved the study of sea level changes at the end of the Ice Age. As glaciers melted between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose dramatically over 100 meters in total. This rise flooded vast coastal plains across the world. Entire regions that once supported human settlements were drowned beneath the expanding oceans. But the scale of these drowned landscapes, though significant, did not align with Plato's depiction of a massive island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. What was lost were not continents but coastal habitats, river valleys, lagoons, small islands, and low-lying regions where early humans lived. Scientists studying submerged archaeology found the remains of ancient campsites, hearths, tools, and settlements beneath the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the waters off Southeast Asia. These discoveries proved that rising seas had indeed erased parts of human history, but they did not reveal any evidence of a highly advanced civilization, let alone one resembling Plato's Atlantis. The flooded regions were consistent with small-scale, early human communities, not vast, technologically sophisticated empires. This understanding reshaped the search for Atlantis by grounding it in the realities of environmental change. It introduced nuance. Yes, ancient worlds were lost to the sea. Yes, memories of floods could inspire myths. Yes, stories of drowned lands might echo real events. But no, there was no evidence for a sudden, catastrophic disappearance of a massive island civilization around 9,600 BCE. The geological processes simply did not support such a scenario. With these scientific findings in place, The Atlantis debate entered a new phase, one in which scholars approached Plato's story not as literal history, but as a layered, symbolic narrative rooted in philosophical, cultural, and environmental realities. Some suggested that Plato may have been inspired by distant cultural memories of real catastrophes like the Thera eruption or the flooding of prehistoric coastlines. Others argued that Atlantis was entirely allegorical, a moral parable illustrating the dangers of hubris and the fragility of human society. Still others proposed hybrid theories, imagining that Plato might have drawn from multiple sources to craft a story that was both myth and commentary. What became clear, however, was that modern science had severed Atlantis from the realm of physical geography. The ocean did not hide a drowned empire. Archaeology did not reveal a lost supercivilization. Geology did not support a sudden continental collapse. The myth, if it was to survive, would have to find a new home not in ancient ruins, but in the symbolic and cultural imagination of humanity. And yet, this scientific demystification did not diminish Atlantis. If anything, it freed the story from the constraints of literal belief. Atlantis no longer needed to be a physical place in order to matter. Its beauty lay not in its coordinates but in its meaning, its ability to encapsulate the rise and fall of societies, the cycles of human ambition, and the longing for worlds beyond our reach. As the 20th century progressed, Atlantis continued to evolve, appearing in literature, film, philosophy, and speculative fiction. But science had drawn the boundary clearly and gently. Whatever Atlantis was, it was not a lost continent beneath the sea. It was something far more enduring, far more flexible, and far more human. As the scientific world of the 20th century settled into its new understanding of the Earth's past, a quiet but persistent question remained suspended in the background, soft, enduring, and strangely stubborn. If Atlantis was not a sunken continent, not a vast drowned empire, not a literal retelling of geological events, then what was the origin of the story? Why did Plato choose the details he did? Why did the tale feel so vivid, so specific, so rooted in imagery that seemed almost, at times, archaeological in nature? And most importantly, could the story have been inspired not by a lost continent, but by memories of real catastrophes, real landscapes, and real ancient societies that had left their traces scattered across the Mediterranean world? These questions gave rise to a new phase in Atlantis research, one that differed profoundly from the theories of Donnelly, Blavatsky, and Cayce. This new approach was careful, cautious, rigorous, and grounded in evidence. It did not attempt to prove that Atlantis existed, as Plato described it. Instead, it sought to understand whether the legend might echo fragments of real events so dramatic that they lingered in cultural memory long enough to be woven into philosophical storytelling. The scholars who embraced this line of thought were not looking for a lost island beneath the sea. They were searching for the historical shadows behind the myth, and as they searched, several possibilities rose to the surface, each fascinating, each compelling in its own way, and each ultimately incomplete. Among all these possibilities, the most studied, the most sophisticated, and the most persuasive was the Santorini hypothesis, centered on one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human prehistory. To understand the power of this event, we must imagine the world of the Aegean around 1600 BCE, when the Bronze Age flourished on the islands and coasts scattered across the Mediterranean. At the center of this world stood the island we now call Santorini, known to the ancients as Thera, a crescent-shaped ring of land encircling a deep volcanic caldera. It was a beautiful, fertile island, its cliffs rising dramatically from the sea, its ports bustling with trade, its villages adorned with art that spoke of a cultured and confident society. One of those villages, buried beneath volcanic ash for millennia, would later be rediscovered as Akrotiri, a remarkably sophisticated Bronze Age city with multi-story houses, advanced plumbing systems, ornate frescoes, and elegant streets that seem to breathe with the memory of ancient life. The eruption that struck Thera around 1600 BCE was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded prehistory. An explosion so massive that it reshaped the island, shredded the caldera, and sent ash clouds high enough to be carried across continents. The blast triggered violent tsunamis that tore across the Aegean Sea, slamming into nearby islands, flooding coastal settlements, and disrupting the powerful Minoan civilization centered on Crete. Trade routes faltered. Agriculture failed. Economic systems collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Political structures crumbled under the weight of environmental devastation. To some modern scholars, it seemed impossible to ignore the parallels. An advanced island civilization, strikingly wealthy, deeply connected to the sea, suddenly devastated by natural catastrophe. Could this cataclysm have been the historical seed that eventually grew into Plato's tale of Atlantis? The similarities were enticing. Acrotyros architecture revealed a level of sophistication that matched the imagery of a highly advanced city. Its art suggested a society that valued beauty, ceremony, and the rhythms of the natural world. Its location, an island with a powerful maritime presence, fit the essence of Plato's geography, if not its exact coordinates. And its destruction, sudden and overwhelming, seemed tailor-made for a legend about a world swallowed almost instantly. But as further research unfolded, the differences became clear. The island of Thera, even at its largest, was far smaller than the massive landmass described by Plato. It was not larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. Its political structure did not resemble the 10-kingdom federation Plato imagined. Its destruction occurred in the 16th century BCE, thousands of years later than the date given in Critias. And while the eruption produced catastrophic effects, it did not sink the island into the sea. It collapsed its center and reshaped its coastline. But the landmass itself remained. Thus, while Santorini provided an emotionally satisfying parallel, it could not be Atlantis. Its value lay not in confirming the legend but in offering insight into how catastrophic events might echo through cultural memory long enough to inspire later stories. It suggested that Plato could have drawn upon a tapestry of real disasters, real ruins, and real histories woven into a philosophical metaphor far more complex than any single event. The Santorini hypothesis, then, was both compelling and incomplete. It illuminated the atmospheric conditions that might give rise to a tale like Atlantis, but could not account for the specific details of Plato's description. So scholars turned their eyes to other regions, places whose geography, ruins, or historical patterns offered partial but intriguing overlaps. One such region was Cyprus, an island lying at the crossroads of Greek, Near Eastern, and Mediterranean worlds. Cyprus possessed ancient cities, complex trade networks, and a strategic position that made it a cultural melting pot. Some researchers propose that Plato's island beyond the Pillars of Hercules might have reflected through distorted transmission an eastern rather than western location. Cyprus had ancient copper mines, fortified settlements, and a long maritime tradition. It was large enough to be mistaken for a realm of great power, especially to storytellers who lacked precise geographical knowledge. But despite its significance, Cyprus lacked the dramatic, singular catastrophe that defined Atlantis. Its ruins were numerous but explicable, its timeline incompatible with Platos, and its cultural patterns better understood through interactions with the Near East rather than through an imagined Atlantic empire. Another proposed location was Sardinia, the large island west of Italy, rich in prehistoric ruins known as nuraghi, tower-like stone structures built by the Nuragic civilization. These towers, spread across the island in great numbers, hinted at a sophisticated socio-political system with monumental architecture, advanced metallurgy, and possible maritime strength. Some scholars noted that the circular design of certain complexes bore faint echoes of Plato's concentric city, though the resemblance was limited. Sardinia's location also seemed tempting to researchers searching for a Mediterranean source for the Atlantis legend. Yet again, the evidence failed to satisfy. The Nuragic ruins were impressive but did not align with the scale, chronology, or descriptions Plato provided. There was no record of a sudden destruction, no myth of a drowned kingdom, no geological event that wiped Sardinia from the map. The third candidate in this category was Iberia, particularly the region of Tartessos in southern Spain. Tartessos was a wealthy, enigmatic Bronze Age society, known for its metalworking, trade connections, and unique position at the edge of the known ancient world. Greek writers described Tartessos as prosperous, mysterious, and culturally distinct, a land rich in silver and gold, governed by powerful rulers whose names echoed faintly through fragmented records. To some, Tartessos felt like the right kind of inspiration, a wealthy maritime culture on the western edge of the Mediterranean, capable of leaving a deep mark on Greek imagination. But Tartessos was not an island. It did not vanish. Its decline was gradual, shaped by shifting trade patterns, and unlike Plato's Atlantis, it left archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and cultural remnants. Thus, Cyprus, Sardinia, and Iberia each offered something: a hint, a mood, a half-shadow, but none could bear the full weight of the legend. They were evocative, but not definitive. They provided atmosphere, not proof. This pattern led scholars away from specific locations and toward broader environmental theories, particularly those involving dramatic water level changes in antiquity. One of the most intriguing of these was the Black Sea flood hypothesis, which emerged from geological research in the late 20th century. According to this hypothesis, around 7,500 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosphorus Strait and flooded the basin of the Black Sea, which at the time was a much smaller freshwater lake. The event would have submerged vast tracts of coastal land, displacing populations and transforming the region's geography in a matter of months. Some geologists argued that the scale and suddenness of this flood could have produced deep cultural memories passed down through generations as stories of a great deluge. These memories might then have migrated into various flood myths across the Near East and Mediterranean. In this sense, the Black Sea flood offered a compelling explanation for the universality of inundation stories. It was dramatic, regional, and rooted in geological evidence. But despite its significance, the event did not resemble Atlantis. It involved coastlines, not islands. It occurred thousands of years before any sophisticated civilization existed in the region. It did not destroy a superpower, nor did it sink monumental architecture into the sea. It was a human catastrophe, certainly, but not a Platonic catastrophe. Thus, like the Santorini eruption, the Black Sea flood was historically meaningful but mythologically incomplete. It helped explain why ancient peoples might develop stories of great floods, but it did not match the structure, scale, or themes of Plato's narrative. The final major category of serious Atlantis theories involved the Azores and the Mid-Atlantic region, long favored by enthusiasts because of their dramatic volcanic landscapes and their central location along the ridge where continents drift apart. To romantics, the Azores, with their steep cliffs, lush valleys, and mist-covered peaks, offered the perfect aesthetic backdrop for a drowned primordial world. To early explorers, the region seemed full of secrets: rocky formations beneath the waves, strange seafloor profiles, volcanic plateaus that hinted at ancient cataclysms. To modern imagination, the deep Atlantic held an aura of mystery unmatched anywhere else on Earth. But as sonar mapping and deep-sea research matured into precise sciences, These romantic impressions gave way to clear, unequivocal evidence. The Azores were volcanic islands formed by hotspot activity and tectonic uplift, not by the remains of a vanished continent. Their surrounding seafloor showed patterns consistent with millions of years of geological activity, slow, steady, ancient, not sudden collapse. Any uplifting or subsidence in the region occurred on geological timescales, measured in millions of years, not in the rapid, catastrophic timeframe required by Plato's narrative. No underwater plateaus resembled artificial structures. No sunken walls, roads, or harbors appeared in the sonar imaging. The deep Atlantic revealed itself to be magnificent, but wholly uninhabited by the ruins of a lost world. Through these findings, a pattern began to emerge across the entire range of serious Atlantis hypotheses. Every theory that rested on real evidence, Santorini, Tartessos, Sardinia, Cyprus, the Black Sea, could explain part of the story, but never the whole. And every theory that aligned closely with Plato's description, vast continents, sudden sinking, advanced super-civilizations collapsed under scientific scrutiny. The legend, it seemed, was neither purely historical nor purely fantastical. It belonged somewhere in the liminal space between memory and metaphor, between environment and imagination. As scholars reflected on this pattern, the purpose of their inquiry shifted. Instead of asking, "Where was Atlantis?" they found themselves asking, "Why did Plato tell this story? What combination of history, myth, philosophy, and cultural memory inspired him? How might natural disasters, political anxieties, poetic imagination, and inherited legends have combined into the narrative he created?" The search moved inward, rather than outward, into the psychology of storytelling, the function of myth, and the ways ancient cultures preserved memories in symbolic forms. And in this shift, a new understanding emerged. Atlantis, as a physical place, likely never existed. But Atlantis, as an idea, drew its power from fragments of real events, real landscapes, and real human fears woven together over centuries. The destruction of Thera, the decline of Minoan Crete, memories of coastal flooding after the Ice Age, the grandeur of lost cities, the mystery of ancient ruins, and the universal terror of drowning, all of these threads fed into the fabric of the legend. Plato gathered these threads and shaped them into a moral narrative, a story about hubris, power, virtue, and collapse. He created a parable so compelling that it transcended his intentions and took on a life of its own. By the late 20th century, this was the consensus among serious researchers. Atlantis was not a lost continent, but a literary creation inspired by a mosaic of real historical and environmental phenomena. It was not a geographical mystery waiting to be solved, but a philosophical narrative woven from carefully chosen imagery. Its meaning lay not in its location, but in its message, one that remains strikingly relevant even today. Atlantis, in the modern scientific view, is a story about the fragility of civilization, the dangers of arrogance, the vulnerability of human societies to environmental forces, and the enduring power of myth to shape the way we understand our past. It reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, that memory transforms over time, and that stories often reveal deeper truths than literal history. It teaches that humanity's greatest questions about origins, identity, morality, and destiny are often held within myths that blend fact and imagination into something more powerful than either one alone. And in this way, Atlantis survives not as a place, but as a metaphor, a mirror, and a timeless reflection of the human condition. As the 20th century blossomed into an age of imagination, technology, and global storytelling, Atlantis found a new home not in the writings of philosophers, nor in the visions of mystics, but in the vast, colorful landscape of popular culture. Here, free from the constraints of scholarship and the strict gaze of science, Atlantis could become anything it needed to be. a shining city beneath crystal waves, a forgotten kingdom, illuminated by strange bioluminescent light, a realm of warriors, sorcerers, or lost technologies. Popular culture offered the myth a new kind of immortality, one shaped not by logic, but by dreams. One of the earliest and most influential voices to bring Atlantis into this modern imaginative world was Jules Verne, the master of visionary fiction whose works helped define the very idea of adventure storytelling. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870, Verne introduced readers to Captain Nemo, a mysterious figure who sailed the deep oceans aboard the Nautilus, an advanced submarine far beyond the technology of his time. Within this world of underwater wonders, Verne wove a moment of quiet awe, the discovery of a submerged city that echoed the ancient memory of Atlantis. In Verne's vision, Atlantis was not a place of mysticism or prophecy, but a poetic ruin, a vestige of human achievement reclaimed by silence. Marble columns lay broken among the corals. Streets once filled with life rested beneath shifting currents. Statues stared across centuries of darkness as if waiting for a world that no longer existed. Verne's description was brief yet deeply evocative, capturing the melancholic beauty of a lost civilization. For many readers, it was the first time Atlantis felt tangible, a place of ruins you could almost touch, a world that seemed both possible and unreachable. Verne did not try to prove Atlantis. He simply let it breathe within the quiet expanse of the sea. And in doing so, he shaped the earliest modern visual memory of what Atlantis could be. As the 20th century advanced, Atlantis drifted into another realm of storytelling, one louder, bolder, and far more vivid, the world of pulp fiction, comics, and heroic fantasy. These were the decades of swashbuckling adventurers, mythic warriors, and colorful magazine covers that blurred the line between legend and spectacle. In this world, Atlantis was reinvented again and again. Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, imagined Atlantis as the ancestral homeland of Conan's people, a fierce, primal world whose fall shaped the destinies of later ages. The idea of Atlantis as a lost warrior culture resonated deeply with readers who craved tales of strength, struggle, and ancient grandeur. From the pages of pulp magazines, Atlantis emerged not as a philosophical metaphor, but as a stage for epic battles, heroic lineages, and forgotten magic. Then came the comic book age, where Atlantis took on new life in universes populated by superheroes and gods. In the Marvel Universe, Atlantis became the kingdom of Namor the Submariner, a powerful anti-hero torn between the ocean and the surface world. Namor's Atlantis was a realm of regal architecture, advanced underwater technology, and political drama, an entire civilization hidden beneath the waves. Marvel's writers used Atlantis to explore themes of isolation, environmental fragility, and the tension between progress and destruction. In the DC universe, Atlantis became the kingdom of Aquaman, a hero whose story blended royalty, legacy, and the responsibility of protecting two worlds. DC's Atlantis was part mythical, part futuristic, glowing towers, underwater energy shields, ancient artifacts of immense power. This Atlantis was not a ruin but a thriving metropolis, a visual spectacle rendered in blues, greens, and shimmering gold, defining how millions of readers imagined the lost kingdom. Through these comic worlds, Atlantis became a visual icon. It was a place of impossible beauty and danger, a world suspended between ancient myth and science fiction. In the hands of artists and illustrators, its domes glowed with inner light, its towers twisted in spiral patterns, and its people moved with a grace shaped by oceans rather than air. Popular culture had transformed Atlantis into something new, a symbol of wonder, a canvas for creativity, a realm of endless possibility. But perhaps no modern interpretation of Atlantis reached as wide or as deeply into human imagination as the one brought to life by animation and film. In 2001, Disney released Atlantis, The Lost Empire, a film that blended adventure, archaeology, mysticism, and steampunk aesthetics into a single vibrant vision. For an entire generation, this film became the definitive image of Atlantis. It portrayed the city not as ruins, nor as myth, but as a living civilization hidden beneath centuries of change. Towering stone structures glowed with crystal energy, floating vehicles drifted through turquoise light. Ancient technologies pulsed with spiritual power. The Atlantean language, constructed by linguist Mark Okrand, had its own syntax, structure, and elegance, adding authenticity to the world building. What made the film especially impactful was its tone, a sense of longing, of rediscovery, of connection between past and present. The Atlantis of Disney was a place where beauty met mystery, where technology met tradition, where history met myth. For many viewers, it became the most vivid and beloved depiction of Atlantis they would ever encounter. Beyond Disney, Atlantis appeared across countless films, documentaries, series, and animated projects. It became a recurring setting in science fiction, fantasy, and adventure stories. Directors imagined it as a cradle of ancient aliens, a warning about ecological collapse, or a utopian world undone by hubris. Each rendition blended new ideas with old patterns, reflecting the cultural mood of its time. In cinema, Atlantis was never one thing. It was many things at once, reflective, adaptive, endlessly reborn. Then came the final transformation, one made not by authors, studios, or philosophers, but by ordinary people across the world. With the rise of the internet, Atlantis entered a space more fluid and democratic than any form of storytelling in history. On forums, blogs, YouTube channels, and later TikTok feeds, Atlantis became a collective dream, reshaped every day by thousands of voices. Some created animations imagining the architecture of the lost city. Some crafted theories linking Atlantis to Antarctica, the Amazon, or even outer space. Some built entire virtual worlds where Atlantis could be walked through, explored, and inhabited. Others used calming visuals, deep ocean footage, soft music, glowing lights to present Atlantis as a meditative sanctuary, a landscape of serenity ideal for sleep, reflection, or escape. In this digital era, the legend became decentralized. There was no single image of Atlantis, there were thousands, each shaped by the imagination of the creator. Some versions were mystical, filled with crystals and ancient energy. Others were scientific, based on geological models and 3D reconstructions. Others still were whimsical, dreamy, or surreal, drawing the viewer into soft blue worlds designed for relaxation. Perhaps most beautifully, the internet allowed people to use Atlantis as a mirror for their personal inner worlds. For some, it symbolized lost history. For others, lost knowledge. For others still, lost peace, an imagined past where human beings lived in harmony with nature, with one another, or with themselves. Atlantis began as a philosophical parable, then became a legend, then a mystical homeland, then a playground for storytellers. But in the digital age, it became something even more intimate, a place where people could rest their minds, escape for a moment from the noise of reality, and drift into the soft calm of imagination. And so, through books, comics, films, and the boundless creativity of the internet, Atlantis found a new kind of immortality, one no longer tied to archaeology or geography, but to the quiet, universal human desire for wonder, the desire to believe in hidden worlds, the desire to imagine what has been lost and what might yet be found, the desire to dream. Across thousands of years, The story of Atlantis has drifted through human imagination like a quiet tide, soft, persistent, and strangely comforting. Even when evidence fades, even when science draws its boundaries, the legend still lingers in the human mind. It remains there because Atlantis is far more than a place. It is a symbol, a reflection of our collective hopes, fears, memories, and desires. To understand why Atlantis endures, we must look not at oceans or ruins, but inward, into the deep currents of psychology and culture that shape how we tell stories about ourselves. Atlantis, in its most essential form, represents the idea of a golden age already lost. Almost every culture carries a memory of a time when the world felt harmonious, balanced, and whole. A time before corruption, a time before decline, a time when humanity lived closer to truth, nature, and wisdom. Atlantis allows us to project this longing onto a distant horizon, a civilization perfect enough to inspire awe, yet distant enough to escape the flaws of real history. When we imagine Atlantis, we are not imagining stone walls or harbors. We are imagining the version of ourselves we wish could have existed, a version unbroken by conflict or confusion, a version capable of reaching heights we can barely comprehend today. But Atlantis also resonates because it speaks to one of the deepest emotional currents in the human psyche, the fear of destruction. Every person, at some point, senses how fragile life is, how quickly things can change, how suddenly worlds can collapse. Civilizations rise slowly, but they fall in moments. Earthquakes, wars, fires, floods, and the silent erosion of time have erased countless societies whose names we will never know. Atlantis holds that fear in a single image, a great world swallowed in one night. It reflects our anxiety about loss, about impermanence, about the possibility that even the greatest human achievements can vanish without warning. The legend allows us to process this fear safely, gently, from a distance, like looking at a storm through a window rather than standing in the rain. Yet intertwined with that fear is something softer, brighter, and just as powerful, the hope of rediscovery, the hope that wisdom, once lost, can return. The hope that humanity has roots deeper than we imagine. The hope that the knowledge we crave about our origins, our purpose, our potential still lies hidden somewhere, waiting to be awakened. Atlantis embodies that hope. It whispers that the past was richer than we know, that human beings have capabilities waiting to be remembered, that beneath our confusion, there is a foundation of ancient intelligence still echoing in the background of time. This idea comforts us. It suggests that progress is not only forward, but also backward, that understanding who we once were might help us understand who we could be. There is also something profoundly human in our desire to believe that the past is unfinished, that there are still mysteries unsolved. In a world mapped, measured, scanned, and photographed, Atlantis restores the thrill of the unknown. It reminds us that the world is still larger than our knowledge of it, that beneath the layers of history lies a silence we have not yet fully explored. This craving for unfinished stories is rooted in cognitive science. The mind dislikes gaps and seeks patterns even where none exist. When we hear a story that stops abruptly, like Plato's Critias, our minds instinctively try to complete it. Atlantis becomes a puzzle that invites endless interpretation, allowing each person to fill its silence with their own imagination. Culturally, the myth also fulfills another deep need: the desire to connect with something bigger than the present moment. Modern life is fast, fragmented, and often disconnected from the rhythms that once shaped human existence. Atlantis feels like a tether to ancient memory, a reminder that the human story stretches far beyond the narrow window of our daily lives. It comforts us to imagine that beneath the surface of modern complexity lies an older simplicity, a time when human identity was tied to oceans, stars, and the slow turning of the seasons. In this way, Atlantis functions almost like a dream encoded into culture, a dream shared across generations. Psychologists describe these enduring symbols as archetypes, patterns that live in our collective unconscious. Atlantis aligns with several archetypes at once: the lost paradise, the fallen empire, the warning of hubris, the journey of return. Because it carries so many archetypal threads, the myth becomes endlessly adaptable. It can be a scientific puzzle, a spiritual memory, a moral lesson, or simply a place of beauty that lives in imagination. Whatever form it takes, it speaks to something universal, something that belongs not only to Plato, or philosophers, or mystics, but to all of us. And perhaps the most tender reason we never let go of Atlantis is this: Atlantis allows us to believe that even when something is lost, its essence may continue in another form. A civilization may vanish, but its wisdom lives on. A story may fragment, but its meaning remains. Atlantis teaches us that disappearance is not the end, it is transformation. It is memory reshaped into myth. It is the soft reminder that human achievements, though fragile, leave ripples across time. So when we return to the legend of Atlantis late at night, in moments of quiet thought, or through stories whispered across centuries, we are not just seeking a lost island, we are seeking ourselves. We are seeking the parts of the human story that feel ancient, mysterious, and unfinished. We are seeking comfort in the idea that the world is still full of wonder, and as long as that need exists, the myth will never fade. Atlantis will continue to drift through culture like a gentle current, soft, steady, and eternal. A dream we share, a memory we reinvent, a story that, even in silence, never truly sinks. As we reach the end of this long and gentle journey, the story of Atlantis rests before us like a quiet shoreline, smooth, reflective, softened by distance and time. We have traced its path from Plato's philosophical imagination through centuries of doubt, rediscovery, speculation, and transformation, until it grew into one of the most enduring legends humanity has ever carried. And now, in this final moment, we are left with a simple truth. Atlantis may or may not have been real, but its meaning has always been larger than its geography. It has always been a mirror showing us who we are, what we fear, what we hope for, and what we wish we could become. When Plato first told the story, he was not trying to chronicle a forgotten empire. He was trying to speak to the human spirit. He wanted to remind his listeners that even the greatest societies can fall if they forget the virtues that made them strong. He wanted to warn that ambition without balance becomes destruction, and that power without wisdom becomes ruin. And he wanted to teach that civilizations, like individuals, can lose themselves when they abandon humility. Atlantis was never just a place, it was a lesson. A quiet reminder about the fragile line between greatness and collapse. Across the centuries, the world changed, but the heart of the message stayed the same. People saw in Atlantis the echo of their own societies, ambitious, brilliant, full of potential, yet vulnerable to excess and pride. They saw the rise and fall of empires mirrored in its fate. They saw the weight of human choices reflected in its final night beneath the sea. And perhaps that is why the legend endures. Atlantis allows us to contemplate our own future by looking gently into an imagined past. But the story also carries something far more tender. It carries the sense of wonder that has always lived within human beings, the sense that the world is deeper than we know, that mysteries still exist. That beauty can be lost and perhaps found again. Atlantis invites us to dream without needing proof, to feel connection without needing certainty, to explore ideas without needing maps. It belongs as much to the soul as it does to the mind. And so, whether Atlantis was a memory, a metaphor, or a masterpiece of imagination, its purpose remains the same: It teaches us to respect what we build, to remain humble before the forces that shape our world, to remember that every society, no matter how advanced, is woven from fragile threads of choice, virtue, and balance. It teaches us that wisdom is more powerful than wealth, that integrity lasts longer than monuments, and that the true measure of any civilization is not its size, but its character. Most of all, the story reminds us that even when something is lost, it can still guide us. Its absence becomes a kind of presence. Its silence becomes a kind of voice. Atlantis sinks, but the lesson rises. It floats on the surface of time, clear and calm, reminding us to move through the world gently, thoughtfully, with awareness of how easily everything can change. Now, as the story settles into its final quiet, allow yourself to breathe a little deeper. Let your shoulders soften. Let the tension in your body fade like the ebb of a slow tide. Imagine the waves moving with steady rhythm, carrying the last echoes of Atlantis into the open sea. There is nothing to solve now, nothing to question, nothing to chase. Only the soft awareness that you have traveled far through history and imagination, and that the journey itself has brought you to a place of calm. If Atlantis teaches us anything, it is that all things, cities, empires, stories, even worries rise and fall. Nothing is permanent, and that impermanence can be peaceful when we learn to accept it. You can let the legend drift now, like a lantern released into the night. You can let its light soften into memory. You can hold on to the parts that comfort you and let the rest dissolve like sand beneath the water. Soon, your mind may begin to quiet. Thoughts may grow slower. Breath may grow softer. The world around you may blur at the edges. That is all right. This is the moment the story was meant to arrive, at a moment of stillness, where imagination gives way to rest. So let the final image of Atlantis be peaceful, not a city collapsing, but a city resting beneath calm blue water, light drifting gently through the waves, columns softened by time, silence holding everything in place, a world not lost, but transformed, becoming part of the deep, steady cradle of the sea. And as you drift with it, allow yourself the same kindness. Allow yourself to rest. Allow your mind to wander without direction. Allow sleep to come naturally, like a tide returning home. Because the legend ends here, in calm, and you, too, can end your day here, in this same calm. Atlantis may be gone, but the quiet it leaves behind is yours to keep.